So welcome everybody. Good morning and welcome to today's seminar. This is the second in our two-part series. So for those of you who joined us last October, you're very welcome back. Both sessions will be recorded and they'll be available online in the coming weeks once we have all of the relevant authorities put in place. My name is Colette Bennett. I'm a policy analyst with NESTA and I'm a member of the Social Sciences Committee of the Royal Irish Academy. I'll be chairing the first session today before we head into the break, and then I'll hand over to my colleague, Professor Cathal O'Donoghue of University of Galway, and he'll chair our second session. So I am delighted to introduce our three speakers for the first session. We have Professor Muiris MacCarthaigh. He's a Professor of Politics and Public Policy at UCD and Director of the new Centre for Public Policy and Administration. His work concerns the role of state administrations in public policy delivery, and he has recently published work concerning the importance of longitudinal perspectives on organisational change in government. Professor MacCarthaigh will be providing the introductory presentation this morning on time and temporality in policy making. After Professor MacCarthaigh speaks, we will then go to Professor Geoff Mulgan. So Professor Mulgan is Professor of Collective Intelligence, Public Policy and Social Innovation with University College London. He has roles in the UK government, he has had roles in the UK government, including Director of the Government Strategy Unit, Director of the Performance and Innovation Unit, and Head of Policy in the Prime Minister's Office. From 2004 to 2011, he was first CEO of the Young Foundation. He has been a reporter on BBC TV and radio and founded or co-founded many social innovation organisations. He's currently an advisor to the European Parliament on science and technology and a senior fellow with Demos Helsinki. Professor Mulgan will concentrate his presentation on global perspectives on time in policy making. And then finally, in the first session, we will go to Professor Thomas Hale. He is Professor of Global Public Policy, Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford. I hope I've gotten that right, Thomas. Professor Hale's research explores how we can manage transnational problems effectively and fairly. He seeks to explain how political institutions evolve or don't evolve to face the challenges raised by globalization and interdependence, with a particular emphasis on environmental, economic and health issues. He holds a PhD in politics from Princeton University, a master's in global politics from the London School of Economics, and an AB in public policy from Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs. He has studied and worked in Argentina, China and Europe, and will be presenting today on long problems, representing future generations in today's policy making. So I think we can all agree that we have an incredibly interesting and exciting panel for the first session this morning. Each presentation will last about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will hold a panel Q&A once all three speakers have presented. If any participant has any questions, please do put them in the Q&A by clicking on the button at the very bottom of the screen there, and we'll do our best to get to them all. So without further ado, I will hand over now to Professor MacCarthaigh. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Colette. And I'll just make sure this is working before I say anything substantial. Is that the right screen or do I need to swap it around again?
Swap it again.
How's that now? Great, excellent. Okay, good morning, everybody. It's really nice to see some familiar faces here, and welcome to everybody who's joined for the event. And I really want to thank my colleagues, Colette and Cathal, and indeed Martha from the Academy that we've worked with. I mean, gosh, it must be a year ago or something, we started toying around with this idea of doing something around time and longitudinal perspectives, and came up with this two-part series. So the first part was actually on the actual policy issue of aging and issues around intergenerational fairness and how do we plan for an older society and so on. And today is more about, I guess, thinking about long-term perspectives on public policy. Now, from an Irish perspective, the timing is great. The draft programme for government released yesterday, I saw, had plans in it of an office for futures planning and so on. And it's very much in vogue nowadays. And I know my colleagues, Geoff and Tom in this first session will certainly be talking about this, like looking forward and how do we plan and prepare for what government can do in the future. My interest is a little bit about looking backwards, as it were. I mean, there's two ways to think about long-term planning. It's a learning from the past, and historical perspectives on public policy are very popular now. They're very popular in economics. They're very popular in public policy now. So I think it's useful to think about that, and then also to think about what we can draw from those perspectives looking forward as well. Now, just to I guess, excuse me, get things going, we might say, well, why why are time and temporality important at all? Why should we care about these issues? Well, academically, much of research that is conducted on government is static. It's snapshots. It's cross-sectional. What's going on? How can we understand it? How can we look at it from different perspectives and so on? But interestingly, a lot of theories of public administration and of public policy are more dynamic in nature. They're about change. They're about how do we understand change over time. Compared to other disciplines, a lot of the work is light and empirics because the data effectively isn't there to test some theories. We have a lot of cross-sectional single snapshot data, but we don't have those, well, as many data sets that give us those long-term perspectives that we can learn from and test some of the hypotheses around, well, why does change happen the way that it does? And practically, of course, most policy problems don't align with pre-existing policy processes, so things like natural disasters, pandemics, issues of public debt, climate and biodiversity, these cut across organizations, these cut across established ways of working. So we need to think about, well, how do we better prepare and plan for these over a longer term? And as mentioned, more and more governments around the world are accepting this and trying to institutionalize longer term thinking, future generational thinking into their ways of developing policy. Now, just to separate out a little bit the concepts of time and temporality, I mean, there's a kind of a long established way of thinking about time that we have kind of time as, as a objective concept, something takes a week to do or a day to do or an hour to do or a year to do indeed. This is the chronos idea, and then we have this more kairos concept around it's a more subjective interpretation of time, and it's how people, I guess, talk about things like, well, we all talk about like life before COVID or pre-COVID or during COVID or after COVID. It's or before a particular war historically and so on is how people would have counted time. So thinking about time in a more subjective way. So there's different ways in which time is conceptualized. And then the concept of temporality, and I really love the work Klaus, who's going to be speaking later, has done on this, about this idea of different rates of change and how within governments you often have this misalignment between the different speeds at which things politicians, for example, want to see happen and the speed at which it actually takes, or the time it takes to actually do something. So these misalignments. So sometimes you will have urgency around a policy problem, so it must be supercharged, and time must be very, very quick. And other times we'd like to think of policies being developed slowly and carefully over time with a view to longevity, as it were. So we can think about policy change as happening fast, slow, linear, stepwise. Changes are happening a lot or a little, and some changes can have very short-term effects, and others can have enormous long-term consequences as well. So there are different ways and dimensions of thinking about temporality when it comes to public policy. And the beauty of all of this is, and why we probably should do more of it, certainly in the study of government, is that it allows us to understand why do some policies endure over time when others do not? How can we understand this? How can we make sense of why some are more successful, if we interpret endurance as success? What causes this? And underlying sleeper effects, so things that may not immediately be obvious but have consequences for the success or otherwise of policy. You can only examine these by taking these long-term perspectives and saying, well, why did something go very well or go very badly? And it won't be immediately obvious from looking at the policy today. You need to go back and understand the origins and things that have happened along the way. So again, as I say, these historical perspectives on public policy are extremely useful and have great practical use as well. Now, this is, a quarter of a century ago, we had some of the big names in public policy research really criticizing the field of going like, why, again, compared to other disciplines in the study of public policy, why do we have such poor resources? Like, why has there not been an investment in the study of public policy and the creation of data sets and resources for us to examine this more closely, as you would in other disciplines? And there's lots of reasons put forward. I mean, the usual thing in academia, the costs. It's a huge investment. It takes time. It takes years in some cases to build up some of these resources. and people's tenure, just the practical realities of trying to secure academic posts and so on, it just does not align. I mean, it's this alignment issue again, that people's careers, it's a big gamble to say, look, I'm going to take a decade to put together a really substantial global data set, but in some cases it can take that long. There's changing interpretation. What is health policy today is vastly different from what health policy was 100 years ago, of course. So you need to be very careful about what you're talking about when comparing things over time. The interpretation of what social policy might mean would be very different today as it was again a century ago. And there's a lot of training involved, with training people to understand the different methodologies and so on, to invest in such database development. And so, generally speaking, in most of the established textbooks for the study of public administration policy, there's not very much at all on long-term perspectives. Lots on other ways of examining public policy, but very, very light on these kind of very basic historical, longitudinal perspectives on public policies. And so, taking snapshots like a census every 5 years or 10 years is very useful, of course. But it's not perfect either when you've changing populations in the case of some, or changing organizations and so on, in the case of the study of governments, for example. So I don't mean to go through all of these, but just by way of contrast, in political science, there's wonderful databases going back hundreds of years of, who's in charge, who are these people, where do they come from, how are they educated, what did they do? So the resources there have been brilliant about understanding, well, how is the world in effect governed? Who gets into power, and how do they hold it? Excellent electoral data sets. We know an awful lot about voting behavior and patterns and so on. World Value Survey, of course, is very well established as well. Lots and lots of election studies, and in economics and sociology as well. We have, across the developed world, these growing up in X country, these cohort studies where people are followed over time and providing really, really wonderful insights into how people live and the changing profile of various demographies. There's household panel studies, and increasingly we see governments funding these record linkage studies. So linking together data from, say, social welfare agencies across to health agencies, across to justice and policing and so on, like looking and investing in connecting these types of data together. And I know Geoff, for example, who's going to be speaking next, has been very much involved in these for many years. So there are a number of resources that are available to us looking at state organizations, so public administration systems. They're very limited. The Norwegians have a database that they created. The Norwegian state database covers things like political parties and the public service and public sector organizations from 1947. I've been involved in a project, which some of you in the call will be aware of, the Irish State Administration Database, which we think is the oldest in the world in terms of the span that it covers. So now 103 years of data on the Irish public administration. And there have been other projects. So David Levy-Farr had a wonderful project mapping the emergence of regulatory bodies across the world between 1966 and 2007. And that spawned a massive amount of research and understanding on how states regulate. And Rod Rhodes was involved in trying to map the complex system of government in Whitehall over a period of decades as well. And there's a database on American state administrators, people who head up state agencies in the United States. And the Comparative Agendas project is probably the best one around, and this is looking at the what policies are focused on by government, media, state legislators, and so on around the world. That's the Comparative Agendas project, but certainly not as many as I say in other disciplines. But it is a growing field, and there are better resources now than ever before. Just in the Irish case I've mentioned, I mean, we've been able to look at things like this. Like this basically is the story of the Irish state. It's the number. It's 103 snapshots, as it were. How many public organisations of various hues and colours have there been since the foundation of the state, just over 100 years ago? And you can see, I mean, it sort of maps along economic development as well. They're a big boom in the 90s and then tapering off following the economic crash. But it provides you with interesting perspectives. Like behind each of these is hundreds of organizations, and we have great data now on what are they and what are the areas that governments have got into and got out of over time, and what do, you know, this maps onto changing expectations around democracy as well, about what it is people want, expect governments to be doing. And if you were to take, I mean, just by way of contrast, 100 and so years ago, here's what Irish government looked like on the left of your screen, you know, singular departments, you know, 10 of them. And you jump forward to today, well, there's almost double the number of ministries, and they're all most of them are multifunctional. So these, you know, these two bookends, as it were, tell the story of and the trajectory of ever more complex and how states in effect become involved in more and more things over time. They find it very hard to stop doing things. And so there's very interesting work going on at the moment around the issue of policy accumulation, and in fact, governments in the Western world, that, you know, the cup is beginning to overflow, because the rate at which governments are taking on new policies far exceeds the rate at which governments are stopping engaging in previous policies. And new governments come in and layer on their policies and so on. So, as I say, I just wanted to start today by saying, look, let's not forget about the looking backwards to learn from what has happened. Much of the discussion today is going to be about looking forwards, which is, of course, more problematic. But it is a very real question. I mean, there's a fascinating concept at the moment that there's a good chance that children born today could live to be 100 years old. And you sort of ask the question, well, what does this mean? What will the state you're in look like in, you know, 2125? I mean, it's an actual possibility that, a very real possibility that a large number of people will live to see 2125. But in the shorter term, well, what about 2035 or even, you know, 2055? What is the state going to look at? There's a lot of things we know. We know about the changing demographics, as we had in our last session when we looked at the issue of aging. We know there are big advances in things like quantum computing, in issues like the metaverse, in issues like synthetic biology, and sort of democracy is always changing, of course, as well. There's these huge challenges, and, you know, climate and biodiversity is by far the huge topic, which Tom is going to be speaking about as well. So how do we plan and adjust for these things are very live questions, or should be very live questions for government at the moment. So today hopefully follows on nicely for those of you who attended the first seminar on aging. We want to think about adopting these long-term perspectives and approaches to policy challenges, to hear from colleagues who either work internationally or engage very much internationally and are familiar with what's going on in other jurisdictions. And yeah, to hopefully everybody on the call will develop new ideas today, will advance their thinking and maybe make connections with others who are attending. So thank you all very much for joining, and I'm happy to hand over to Geoff, Colette, if that's okay, unless there are any burning questions.
We will save all burning questions till all speakers have spoken. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting presentation and really sets out the context of what we're doing today. So thank you so much for that, Muiris. I'm now going to move along to Professor Geoff Mulgan and his presentation on global perspectives on time in policymaking. Thank you so much, Professor Mulgan.
Well, thank you very much. That was fantastic, Muiris. And I hope we can come back to longitudinal and cohort studies. Certainly in social policy, those have been absolutely vital for clarifying patterns of social change or mobility and so on, and often showing up false understandings. I love this topic. I don't know what the answers are, but I think it's the right question to be asking. Governments definitely do struggle with the longer time horizons, let alone 100-year lifespans. But I actually think social science struggles as well. And I think we're still waiting for a kind of Einstein of social science who can give a meta theory linking biological time, social time, institutional time, cultural time, and so on in a coherent way. I've never read it. If it exists, you know, I would love to read it, because working in government, I found this actually one of the missing bits of theory we often needed to understand the rhythms of change. And I think all of us sort of assume we're in an era of intense short-termism, social media, stock markets, politics driven by opinion polls. And yet many institutions do act very long term in business. If you're in mining or pharmaceuticals, you have to take a 20, 30-year time horizon, and governments in practice do some very long-term things. So what I'm going to do is a couple of minutes each on sort of 5 quick headings, which I think are hopefully relevant to this. And I'll start with strategy. So as you said, I ran a strategy team in the UK government. We at the peak about 150 people, and then strategy teams across the different departments, and ran at that point a fairly loose network of similar teams around the world, from China to Canada, Latin America, and so on. And I put some of this in a book about 10 or 15 years ago. And in a way, this was a sort of fairly simple idea of strategy, taking political authority, using all sorts of capabilities, trying to understand complexity. There's a whole body of theory about different types of field you can change over different horizons, and so on. What's kind of striking, if you're asking about a global perspective, is that after the financial crisis in 07, 08, actually most of the democracies pretty much gave up on this for domestic policy. So I get asked a lot by governments around the world to advise on strategy, but it's mainly autocracies in the Gulf or in East Asia. To a degree, the Scandinavians have kept some serious long-term capability. Norway with its sovereign fund, Finland has a committee of the future and a future foundation. But overall, UK, France, Germany, US have pretty much given up, don't have capabilities in the heart of government doing long-run strategy of any kind at all, which is kind of extraordinary. One of the fairly obvious things we said then is that if you are a minister, a prime minister, a mayor, you have no choice but to divide your time between these different kind of time horizons. And probably you can't help having half your time on the very short term, the crises, the scandals, the issues, the events which knock in on you. But it's vital you put some of your time into the medium term, into implementation, and some into the more long-term strategic stuff. And this is really a very basic issue, literally, of diary management. Some don't do this, and so they become slaves of the immediate, the tyranny of the urgent rather than the important. But the good ones tend to, not only in their own time, but also the institutional structures of the state, create teams who are focused on these different horizons. The UK state, interesting at the moment, has nothing basically on the longer ones. Hopefully this will be addressed in the next 6 months in Downing Street in the Cabinet Office, but it's a weird shortening of time horizons we have seen. And so just a couple of comments on really the challenge of organising time. As I said, in reality, governments have these very different time horizons on pensions reform, infrastructure investment, R&D, which will have very long-term impacts, educating small kids, where you're trying to, in theory, work out what will be useful in 20 or 30 years' time, and so on. But they often don't have a very coherent account of why different time horizons are needed. Some have stumbled into creating arm's-length bodies to do some of the really long-term ones, to get cross-party buy-in on things like pensions reform. We have in the UK a National Infrastructure Commission, and so on. But it's often a little bit haphazard. And as was said, often governments do very slow what should be fast. They have often very sluggish processes, often very, AI is the current example, which has taken years for governments to get even the most basic capabilities on AI, which I would never expected it to take quite so long. But there's an opposite as well. Often governments, I think, do very fast what should be done slow. And there's a whole theory of which kind of tasks need slowing down to get to better judgment and decisions, often separating diagnosis from prescription and action. And my one-liner always on governments, and I'm not alone in saying this, is they tend to overestimate what they can achieve short-term and underestimate what they can achieve long-term. And so there's a sort of meta question of what is the appropriate time rhythm for different tasks. And there's a question of accountability. Most of our accountability structures are very focused on the present and the past, but actually in any good organization, you should be holding the decision makers to account for what legacy they are leaving to their successors 5 or 10 years' time. And that's an issue for select committees, for audit, and many, many other things. And I think we often have rather weak accountability for the future and often very strong accountability for the recent past. Anyway, that's a topic we might come on to. So a second topic, which Tom's going to talk about as well, is future generations. Last summer, I published this survey on the sort of future generations institutions around the world, partly prompted by what was happening in Wales with the Future Generations Commissioner. Just a week after we published this, Ursula von der Leyen announced there would be a Future Generations Commissioner in the Commission, which is now the Commissioner from Malta. And in this paper, we tried to look at these different structures, institutions, some in parliaments, like in Finland or Uruguay. Some have come and gone in Israel and Hungary, and some trying to have a role within the state. It's obviously impossible for a single Future Generations Commissioner to represent all of the issues. And so quite a lot of the paper is trying to look at what might the next generation of these be, with much more comprehensive capabilities, methods, and so on everything from big risks, like the AMOC switch in the Atlantic, which would have a pretty big effect on Dublin, through to biorisks, but also thinking about intergenerational fairness. So I won't talk about that in any detail. One of the things we looked at was the range of institutions sort of doing this stuff. So Singapore has long had its Centre for Strategic Futures. I've worked quite a lot with them in the Prime Minister's office. So that's unusual in a fairly strong capability designed to look 10, 20 years out. On the bottom left is Wales, Derek Walker now running that role. But there's also other things like Dubai's Museum of the Future, top right now, the most Instagrammed place in Dubai, but part of creating a sort of future engagement in a population. And then there's a fascinating subfield on forecasting and tools for mapping the future, with the US intelligence agencies have invested vast sums of money in things like the IARPA programs on forecasting. Where we got to is, and this is where it gets very kind of nerdy, is some of the missing methods on actually getting the right time horizons. And so I just want to very briefly share some work done about 3 years ago on public finance, which I'm now trying to revive in a few countries. We brought this out in the worst possible time in the midst of the pandemic, when time horizons had literally shrunk to weeks or months in finance ministries. But this was really saying that we need a whole array of new methods in public finance to better cope with these different time horizons. And one of the really striking things was that governments investing in roads or airports or physical stuff do use long-term investment approaches. They do amortize the investment. They do look at returns over 20, 30, 40 years and have a whole battery of appraisal methods. But when they're spending money on humans, in education or health, they are still essentially treated as annual expenses, as cost. There's almost no use of investment methods. And this is very paradoxical, because actually humans now last longer than infrastructures and buildings. Humans, as Muiris said, last 80, 90, 100 years. Most buildings will be pulled down after 40 or 50 years, airports and so on. So there's a glaring mismatch between the methods of public finance and the actual needs and priorities of government. And so we set this out in some detail in the report. Now, there are lots of innovations around the world which are trying to bridge that gap, some of which we documented, things like public pound multipliers, a whole array of tools on whole of government or phenomenon-based budgeting, the use of investment methods through things like social and development impact bonds, etc. And we tried to set out how you would embed these much more in the work of a finance ministry, and essentially tag every area of spending with an intended time horizon of impacts, and to catch data on whether those were being achieved or not. To me, this is the obvious route for finance ministries to go in the next 5 or 10 years, and then to train AI to spot the patterns. None have yet done this, amazingly. And one other aspect of this, and crucial again to this discussion, is thinking in terms of balance sheets. So if you have a budget in 2025, as it says 2021, you should always be looking at the likely balance sheet effects of your decisions. That happens quite a bit on the very left-hand one, that is, say, fiscal balance sheets, your pension liabilities, etc. but it happens hardly at all on physical capital, human capital, natural capital. And yet if we imagine competent government in 20 years' time, I think these should be more normal, even if they're a bit sketchy, as part of embedding the right way of making judgments about today's decisions and how they affect the future. And that's largely missing. One very nerdy aspect of this is discount rates. What discount rate do you apply to public spending? Most governments have a standard discount rate, usually linked to the bank discount rate. They're slightly different actually in different countries, and there's a whole set of reasons why. But I actually think even that is completely wrong. And if you look at the reality of government behavior, and as you look at the reality of our own behaviors as human beings, we apply very different discount rates to different things. Something for your children or your grandchildren or your community or your church, you treat very differently from a commercial investment or a building. And I think there's, again, a bit of missing theory on why our actual behaviors are at odds with orthodox economic theory on discount rates, and why any government should be applying a different discount rate to defense spending, climate change, health, and so on. Anyway, it's a whole other issue we might, if there's time, maybe we should get into, but this drives a lot of the reality of public spending decisions. So just two sort of final points. One is to connect to your previous session. So I put out a thing based out of Finland actually a few weeks ago on care and aging and our imagination. And as you said, Muiris, one of the weird things about this era is that we have kids being born with a life expectancy of 80, 90 or 100, but almost complete failure to think in those time horizons. We have both a personal and a societal myopia on this. I think as individuals, we don't really want to think about our own needs 20 or 30 years into the future when we might be weak and feeble and demented and so on. That's the last thing most people want to think about. And our societies are the same. There's a sort of almost collective refusal to face up to it, even in countries like Korea, which face an incredibly rapid aging of their population in the next generation. Their birth rate is now 0.6. I think I was there a few weeks ago doing sessions on this topic. And this raises lots of questions of time horizons. What would it take for today's 20-somethings, 50-somethings, even 60-somethings to be properly part of a conversation about the future of care? How would it be organized? And it's not just the finance of pensions and payment systems which gets all the attention, but in this paper I tried to look at many of the innovations around the world, the innovations in housing, in policy, in uses of technology, in fun, in all the things which might make old age actually rather a pleasurable time to have, rather than a permanent sense of crisis and doom and disaster. And this links to the final point I want to make. It's very striking that although there are great innovations around care around the world, particularly in the Netherlands, Singapore, Spain, I would say, are probably the three countries which I think are doing the most dynamic work on the ground, there's a striking absence of mirroring work either within governments or within universities. Now, within governments, that's part of this much broader sort of crisis of planning and strategy. I've talked to many governments about this topic. They may have a little team in theory working on policy, mainly working on money aspects, but almost nothing looking 20 or 30 years out. And in universities, there are fantastic networks of researchers doing comparative analysis on care systems, let's say, but almost no one working on what is a plausible, desirable pathway to a different kind of way of handling aging a generation or so from now, let's say 2050, 2060, 2070. In the UK, no one funds it. The Economic and Social Research Council never funds future design. They'll fund fantastic analysis and longitudinal studies, but literally nothing on exploration and design and generation of new options. And I've now written a few sort of books on this and done quite a lot of work on the oddity that we're in this era when we can see, a group like this can fairly easily see the big challenges of the next generation or so, whether it's around making the most of AI or aging or climate adaptation, moving to a net zero or a circular economy. But within our two probably centers of brain power, that is to say bits of the state on the one hand and universities on the other, for various reasons that work simply isn't being done. So one of the things I think we need as part of time and temporality in governance is much more focus on what I call exploratory social science. That is the serious work of shaping options a generation or now into the future. Now, some of that is the left hand, that is observation, prediction, looking at the scenarios, the things which might happen. That is also then creative design, imagination, again, in relation to aging, what kind of buildings, what kind of care, what kind of mutual support, and then action and learning. And without that, we in a way become trapped by this, this sort of strangely amplified present. Huge analysis, let's say in the UK, we have fantastic social science on the present, but almost nothing on the future. And it's almost like an echo of what happens in social media with this eternal present, which squeezes out the ability to see time horizons properly. So that's where I'll end. I think we need to actually rethink the time rhythms of governance, both for 100-year lives, but of course also, we'll come onto this, for an era where we're much more aware of the planetary nature of the threats and issues we face around us, not just climate change, but many, many others. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Geoff. That was an extraordinary presentation. I have so many questions of my own, and I've seen a couple come in as well. So we'll take those at the end of the next presentation, and we'll do the Q&A as one. But thank you so much. I'm sure everybody got as much out of that as I certainly did. Moving on then to our final speaker of this session, we have Professor Thomas Hale. So without further ado, Professor Thomas, we will come to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Colette. And I'm not sure, just others may have heard Colette better, but your sound is a little bit soft, just for future reference.
Something that is usually said about me, so I will try and correct that. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for organizing this event. And let me see if I can share my slides. Hopefully you can see that now, but please tell me if you can't. This is, I think, a really important topic, and it's a great pleasure to be speaking after Muiris and Geoff. Not a pleasure in that they've made so many good points. It's hard to improve on them, but just because I think there's a lot of great ideas coming into this space, and events like this are key for advancing our common approach on them. I'm going to speak about a book I published last year called Long Problems, and it's motivated essentially by my work on climate change, which is an example of these kinds of problems, but obviously not the only one. And so I want to use in the book the example of climate change to explore some of two things: the political challenges that these kinds of problems pose for governments, but also, and this is more important even, some of the solutions that governments are already using to address the climate challenge and others, and that I think we can expand on quite readily to make greater progress on these types of challenges, and aging certainly being one of the most important of them. So let me just start by giving you a bit of a thought experiment, though, to motivate this, which is, this is a painting called Dark Satanic Mills. And if you think about the Industrial Revolution, the carbon that came out of the first steam engine to ever go anywhere in the world is still up there, most of it in the atmosphere today, helping to warm our planet with all the other carbon that's been pumped up there in the intervening hundreds of years. And you think about all the carbon going into the world today, it's going to be there for not just our lifetime, but for many lifetimes to come. Indeed, probably for about 1,000 years for it to get down to something like natural absorption. And if you think about that span of time, 1,200 years of human history, think about how much our societies and political institutions and even our basic ideas of the world have changed in that time, and how much more we expect them to time going forward. It sort of begs the question, how can we possibly think about addressing a long problem like climate change by limiting our horizon, our set of solutions, our set of possibilities to the kind of political institutions we know here and now? So if you were up in this picture, a molecule of carbon observing human development over the last 250 years or so into the next millennium, obviously we have to think much more about how political institutions might change, and see this more as a dynamic problem as opposed to a set of constraints that are somehow given out of stone. And indeed, geologists talk about stones as verbs, not as nouns, because they're processes that are going. This is, I think, the shift in social science and policymaking that we need to see going forward as well. So in the book, I try to answer three questions. I try to talk about why, from my field, political economy, we see long problems as hard to govern, and how, nonetheless, we can still seek to govern them. And then I also have a section talking about the theme that both Geoff and Muiris were picking up on, how social scientists should study them. But I wasn't going to speak about that today because it might go on for some time, but it would be wonderful to pick up on it in the conversation going forward. So let me quickly walk through the arguments and try to explain why I think this is such an exciting field. I'll, of course, say what I mean by long problems, what their governance challenges are, and then what solutions are possible. And then I'll finish with a few more concrete implications for what that might mean for climate politics today. But I would put these forward in the spirit of also thinking about how aging or other long problems might be able to find solutions in these same kinds of forms. So first, what are long problems? So I define this very simply as a problem whose causes and effects span more than one human generation. So the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere is, of course, one of these, for the reasons I said. But I think about many of the problems we face, they have this temporal character. And problem length, I think, is a characteristic of all problems we face. And of course, it varies. So if you think about, for example, infrastructure or urban planning or things of building our habitat as humans, these tend to last for a very long time, and choices made by a previous generation can be decisive for shaping the opportunities, the possibilities for future generations. And of course, aging is a key example here. I think pensions are one of the most sharpest examples, though, within the sort of broader category of aging, where many countries set up pension systems in the middle of the 20th century to address needs of the present, assuming a certain demographic structure, assuming a certain nature of work, assuming a certain nature of the corporation, a certain nature of like finance, etc. And many of those factors have since changed. And pensions have been very difficult to evolve and reform over time for reasons I'll go into. But we have a fantastically wide gap between the institutions we have and the nature of the problem we face, which has come into this problem. And if anyone knows what year, last year was the first time in, I think, 3 decades that China changed its retirement age. And it used to be, until last year, 50 for women, 55 for men, for people working class people. And obviously China's economy, life expectancy changed hugely in that time. So this is a really sharp example of where maybe one of the most fundamental challenges a major state seen as a very effective government often still struggles with these kinds of long-term challenges. So that's the problem we face. Why are they hard to govern? Well, this is a slide I show my students because it horrifies them so much, but this is a picture of the leaders gathered at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, where the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was agreed. And in that text, these people here, who, as you'll see, are mostly men of a certain age and position, agreed to prevent dangerous changes in the Earth's climate going forward. And of course, they've now met 29 times since then in different guises in different places and still haven't delivered on this promise. And so it's a really great example, I think, of where governments have known for more than our students' lifetimes about the problem, have been working on it from that time, and still have made limited progress. So why? Why is the answer? What I try to do in the book is organize some of the key political economy factors into 3 sort of theses for why long problems are challenging in politics. And the first of them I call the shadow interest problem, which is basically based on the insight that political change often happens because some group of people or an interest or other actor in society is negatively affected by something, and they push back on that negative impact on them. So they're not trying to build something positive necessarily, they're really reacting against things that are negative. And even people who have very little political agency, very little political power can, throughout history, have risen up and organized themselves to reject these kinds of impacts. Of course, the more concentrated you are, the better. But of course, if these problems are mostly impacting the future, then those people aren't here to be able to protest, to be able to lobby, to be able to otherwise exert pressure onto political situations. And therefore, we are systematically underrepresenting, undervaluing their interest into things that affect them most. And as problem length increases, this problem grows. So the future is only a hazy thing, and we can only glimpse it kind of imprecisely, as this painting might suggest. But that means that future people are entirely dependent on our assessment of their interests and our own alignment to their interests to be able to have any kind of representation in politics. And this is, I think, a pretty strong barrier to effective work on securing their interests. The second problem I call the institutional lag problem, which goes back to the pension example I was mentioning just now. So we create institutions as solutions to any kind of policy challenge. It might be a law, it might be a policy, it might be an organization, it might be an international body, whatever the institution is a set of rules of the game. And to roughly generalize, institutions are effective precisely because they're sticky. They have some sort of endurance across time. We need them to be enduring to be able to shape behavior in any kind of way. But as problem length increases, we have often problems that can change. The pensions example, of course, is a key one. The climate example is another very good example. So the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change famously divided countries between so-called Annex 1 and non-Annex 1. Those countries that were industrialized at the time had to take on greater commitments, and those that didn't. And of course, which countries are industrialized has changed in the last 3 decades. And there's been no ability to really revise that fundamental set of assumptions, which was based on the premise of it. The response instead has been to create more flexibility in the regime, to basically allow a kind of bottom-up approach, which I think has some merits, of course, but it's a reaction to this institutional lag problem, not a sort of solution or an updating that could have been put in place had they been a bit more foresighted in 1992. Security Council reform, another classic example of this. So institutional lag is a big problem as time extends because our solutions become more and more dysfunctional as time increases. And the final political barrier we can see to long problems, you can think of as an early action paradox, which is captured by this smiling individual as he plummets off the top of a building thinking, oh, it's fine so far. What could possibly go wrong? It seems to be great. And there are really two kisses of death for political change. One is uncertainty and one is low salience. Because in both of those situations, it's very hard to organize interest to make some sort of costly shift. If you're in a situation like with climate change, where yes, there will definitely be impacts of some kind, we don't know exactly what they'll be, they're still a little bit uncertain, it's always easier to say, let's not act hastily, let's ask for one more study, let's not be rash and pay this cost if that effect is uncertain. Because we see in markets today, people always think they're going to be in the last 10% that is left after everyone else has fallen off the oil train, for example, or they think it's not going to affect them in some way. So low uncertainty is really a challenge for organizing political change. And of course, salience is equally dangerous. And in conditions of low salience and high uncertainty, it's very easy for especially concentrated interests to defend themselves and therefore to create an obstructionism problem. So this is a systematic barrier as well. So these three characteristics of long problems rather, future people can't act on what affects them, problems change, but institutions stick, and we need to act before the effects are known or salient, are really difficult. And I think anyone who thinks systematically about politics will recognize elements of these in many of the challenges that we face. But the message in the book I really want to convey is not that these barriers are so bad, although indeed they are, but rather that they're actually solvable. They're not solvable, but manageable. And there are no silver bullets. This is not a kind of top 10 listicle of easy solutions to long problems, but rather, I think if you look at where we actually observe and practice, there's a lot of ways that we have been doing this and that we could do better on it. So that's really the main focus I want to unpack in the book. However, as I said, there's no silver bullet to this question of how we govern long problems. And therefore, the solutions are complex and different. And here's a very high-level taxonomy, but also quite a long one. So I won't unpack it all, but I basically try to organize the solutions into 3 different categories responding to those 3 different challenges. So if we have the problem of shadow interest where people in the future can't represent themselves and fight for their interests in politics, we can mitigate that by different ways of creating long-termism. That could be, for example, giving them a representation to future generations, giving an explicit voice in political decision-making to the future. It could go further than that, though. It could actually not just give a voice to the future, but could create some sort of trustee who has some degree of authority to make decisions and is somehow insulated from different kinds of short-term pressures, who can help to make those decisions real. And we can think of different ways of actually extending the time horizons that decision makers use to feed into them. So I'm going to focus on this column just because I don't want to take too much time, but this is, I think, a few great examples. So let me start with a bit of a local look. So Geoff, you mentioned lamented the lack of strategy in central governments around the world. And I think this is indeed a key point. But I actually think we're in a moment of great flux in this issue, and actually some exciting groundswell of small examples beginning to grow around the world, and even just locally in these part of the world. There's quite a few interesting examples to point to, which of course aren't, as you say, Geoff, the kind of highest levels of government taking strategic foresight and planning and long-term outcomes seriously, but actually is sort of bottom-up groundswell of different ideas that we can build on. So what am I speaking about? So in the first category of representing future generations, obviously Wales is a great example. We'll hear, I think, from a representative from the Welsh Commissioner on Future Generations later. But this is a very interesting example of trying to create someone with statutory authority to say things and have agency for future generations and throw that into the political mix. We've seen similar examples of that in places like Hungary or Israel or different manifestations around the world. And what this can do is, I think, help solve an informational problem. So it can say, hey, you might not have thought that future generations about this because you were focused on the short term, but actually, if you think about the long term, here's some implications that you might want to consider, and also can make it more salient. So it helps to address that uncertainty problem and that salience problem to some degree. But of course, informational tools like that only can go so far, right? If you don't have a decision-making power, then you can hopefully recruit allies to future generations this way by giving them information that lets them act or giving them a bit more salience. But it's not the same sufficient often to overcome some of the deepest barriers to that political challenge of shadow interests. And here's where trustees, I think, are important. So let me actually come back to the slide, but I'll jump to what I could think could be one step further than just representing future generations, is to create real authority around future long-term goals. This is California is, I think, a really interesting example of this. It created, under Governor Ronald Reagan, something called the California Air Resources Board, which was created to address smog initially, but over time has become, I think, probably the best example I know of a relatively independent trustee-like regulatory authority with long-term decision-making power with substantive decision-making power to address long-term goals, in this case, climate change. And so when California sets its ambitious climate targets, as it often has done, it has done so through very short bills, like 2 or 3 pages of legislation that basically say, California Air Resources Board, implement this target. And that creates a huge amount of authority into this body to decide how to implement these moves, and isolates it a bit from the usual horse trading that legislatures have, even but the progressive ones like in California, over any major transformation of this kind. And we shouldn't be naive about this. This is not a somehow outside of politics or otherwise invulnerable from some of the forces that don't lead to effective governance. But it's actually quite extraordinary how in a major economy, there's been a massive reliance on quite an arm's length trustee-like body to deliver big economic transformation. With, of course, oversight. So the body here is controlled by a board, which is appointed by the governor for 6-year terms. Governor's term is only 4 years, so it's lasting the political authority that creates it. It has different stakeholder representation. It's fully accountable through the usual administrative law procedures to all sorts of things, but it has an interesting trustee-like quality. In this way, it's similar to two other common institutions we have in many systems, central banks and courts, which are similarly told to be as trustees to act potentially contradicting the short-term interests of the government precisely to unlock a greater benefit of having long-term monetary policy credibility, for example, or in the case of courts, deliver constitutional rule of law and to keep things in check. And so it's amazing to see, for example, this last year, the South Korean Constitutional Court ordered the government to set a longer climate change target precisely because it felt the current target was unfair to future generations, was giving them too much of the burden and not putting enough on the present. And so I think these kind of trustee bodies are really an exciting potential use of dealing with this problem in a more effective way. Let's come back to the final category there. I had representation, giving future voice, trusteeship, tying our hands to institutions. What about extending time horizons? So again, lots of ways to do this. I think Geoff's, the budgeting example Geoff raised is a great example of how this can be put into decision-making practices. But one I want to mention as well is citizen assemblies. So there's lots of interesting research that shows that when you put citizens into the right kind of citizens jury or assembly framework, they actually change their preferences over long-term outcomes. So there's some research, has done surveys of people, do you support this or this? Now think about it for a while with the other citizens in a different frame, and you get very different answers. And that's not maybe surprising. You can always think about how the human political preferences are quite malleable to these kinds of treatments. But it does suggest that actually citizen assemblies can be a useful way to unlock future-oriented preferences. So again, Ireland has, I think, probably one of the most successful examples of a citizens' assembly on climate change really having influence on the policy outcome, but welcome others' views on this, of course. And I can give a local example as well. So here in Oxfordshire, the most difficult challenge local politicians face is on transportation. Everyone wants to drive their cars, everyone's angry about traffic, so this very kind of local issue. And so the solution the county council has put forward is to have a citizens' assembly to talk through some of these trade-offs and to work to a consensus plan. So you have a lot of examples of how time horizons can actually be influenced by the institutional settings that they're made, and that's I think a promising example to build on. Let me just wrap up because I don't want to take too much time with kind of a note of the global scale. So last year the UN had a Summit of the Future, which is a very grand sounding event, and all of the challenges of geopolitics were fully on display, and many of the outcomes were below the ambition that probably the organizers would like them to have achieved. But one concrete outcome was a declaration on future generations, which is a normative document which establishes the commitment of every member state of the United Nations. They all signed it. Even Argentina under Milei said he wouldn't sign it, but actually hasn't done the official unsigning, so it's there in two. And this does three things. It commits governments to safeguard the needs and interests of future generations. It establishes a process for them to talk about how they're doing that with each other, so kind of a review of implementation, and it establishes the role of an envoy for future generations to promote and encourage implementation of these ideas. And that person is still being selected. But I think it's a good example of what the UN potentially can do really well, which is normative change and catalyzing transformations in governance. So obviously this is not going to be an authority body making rules, but if there is this groundswell of action taking place around the world where institutional innovations are bubbling up, and I think they very much are. Geoff mentioned the EU example from last year. Last year, also the Kenyan Senate established a committee of the future. There's dozens of these that you can point to in any given year. If a UN document can help to catalyze and encourage that kind of change, I think that could be a long-term transformation in how we think about governance. And indeed, if it were successful, you might even be able to imagine this kind of transformation is similar in scale to say the rise of human rights as a area of governance and law, where indeed through a UN declaration catalyzing a new way of thinking, governments progressively over decades adopted many deep reforms that haven't, of course, erased human rights violations as a problem around the world, but have created a much richer and more robust system for managing those kinds of challenges than existed before. And I think that's would be an ambition for governments to undertake in the 21st century, as we have long problems like climate change, like demographic change, like infrastructure development, like space waste, like nuclear waste disposal, like antimicrobial resistance, and many others. So this is, I think, a good place for us to focus going forward. Thanks to Lynn there.
Thank you so much for that, Thomas. So that has been an extraordinary morning so far. I think we will now go to some questions. I have plenty myself, but I will take some from the floor first. So I suppose going to you first, Muiris. Tom Ferris had a question in the chat there. Doesn't the publication of the programme for government yesterday reinforce the short-termism of policy making, the 5-year horizon and no further? And if I could just follow up with that, I suppose, how do we use the data that you reference in your presentation to break out of that 5-year cycle into more longer-term thinking?
Yeah, thanks very much, Colette, and I agree. Thanks, Geoff and Tom. It was really super presentations there. Yeah, I mean, this is one issue that's going back a long way, or is kind of well versed in the literature certainly and in practice about this misalignment of electoral cycles, and for civil servants saying, look, this issue is going to take longer than, and you never know when the next election is going to be, do you? I mean, my favorite political slogan is always, the children are our future, and I'm forward looking, I'm not looking past. I mean, it's in the rhetoric of politics to look forward, but the reality is political short-termism is a real problem for some of the issues that Geoff and particularly Tom there in respect of climate point out. How do you get around it? And I mean, there have been innovations within government, and I think there's a question there as well in the chat around, well, how do we start to build this? I mean, the traditional reaction has been to try and like ring fence things like budgets, but also organizations, to create agencies that are at some type of a remove from political short-term imperatives, to try and develop these longer term perspectives, I guess, on urgent issues, yeah, to try and develop some of these. I mean, a lot of governments, we haven't mentioned so far, have started to develop these risk registers, which are, again, all part of the same thing. I'm sure Geoff, for example, has experienced these, that there's probably varying quality in these about trying to predict what are the future challenges coming down the line, how we try to prepare for them. So it is, I do think, as Tom says, it's beginning to permeate, certainly in the developed world, but socializing this into broader concerns amongst the general populations, because that's ultimately what drives politicians, is, well, what are the people looking for? And it's not that it's not there at all. I memean, most people, I think, are concerned about their children, their grandchildren, and so on. But there's definitely a problem there to be. It's a curious feature of democratic politics as we know it. These elections, and how they can actually work to the disadvantage of quality policy in lots of different areas, as have been mentioned. I'm sure the other guys have views on this as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that question came in during your presentation, but if Geoff or Thomas have any views and want to hop in there, please feel free to.
Well, maybe just to jump in. I mean, I agree with all of that, and obviously any decisions have to be made by people in the present. Future generations will never literally have a voice because they don't exist. And I think it's often too easy just to blame the politicians for their short-termism. They are partly reflecting us. We, the public, aren't that keen on spending loads of money which will have a benefit in 40 or 60 years' time. I mean, you may all be the exceptions, but most people are rather attached to their present, standards of living and so on. So we have a series of myopias, but as both of you said, the combination of sort of awareness, showing things like the effects of climate change or aging, conversation, the larger scale, the more structured, the better, where things like citizens' assemblies are useful, and then embedding in institutions which can have a longer time horizon than an individual government, as in the California example or the Norwegian Sovereign Fund. Those are the ways we've got around it. So I just want to throw in one extra thought. So Muiris mentioned risk registers. A long time ago, I had to oversee a sort of overhaul of the UK risk sort of system because we were having lots of crises which weren't being very well prepared for. And we did actually put in place all sorts of, machineries for scanning and assessment and so on. But it was really striking that, and everyone told me this from the past, that you could almost never predict the actual form of the real risk. And that if you'd spent too much money or too much effort, dealing with what looked to be a plausible specific risk, you'd almost certainly be wasting time and money. And therefore, resilience and adaptability was much more important than a sort of a prediction thing. And the one other thought experiment I would throw into this conversation, which we put in our paper on future generations, was just picture someone in 1925 thinking about what the world might want or need in 2025. They get it completely wrong. So we need a lot of humility about the deep uncertainty, even of one generation's time, let alone a century. And that is an emphasis partly for discount rates. You need to be discounting the uncertainty of the future, but also for focusing on this adaptability and resilience and having monitoring capabilities as much as preparation capabilities. So on the Atlantic switchover, the AMOC, which I'm hosting an event on next month, actually, nobody knows. It could happen in 20 years, it could happen in 80 years. It will have huge effects on Ireland and the UK. Our temperatures will be dramatically different. We can't really do that much to prepare, but we can be much better at monitoring and then having society-wide conversations about the signals, the very complex science and modeling of all of that.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thomas, do you have any comments to make in relation to that question?
Maybe just one small point on regime type, and to say something in defense of elections and democracy, which feels like a relevant thing to be talking about in our current present. So the example I gave in China, I think, is really useful because people often say, "Oh, isn't democracy is so inconvenient?" And it's really hard to measure, of course. But I think if you look at any reasonable index of which countries are making good long-term investments in, for example, climate resilience, early childhood education, managing long-term problems well, it's by far more democracies and autocracies that are doing that. So there are some examples like China, maybe Singapore, where individual policies do have a useful long-term, or there's a long-term strategic view that's being taken. But I think it's much harder to say that autocracy is good for long-term planning and democracy is bad. I think the fundamental problem is that any complex organization like a state, no matter how structured, has these kind of internal accountability mechanisms, be they elections or be they Xi Jinping's desire for people to do things. And so in China, the 5-year planning system does have the value of being able to institutionalize goals over time and to set them. But there's many conflicting priorities, so it's not always clear to lower level officials which priority is the one they should really focus on, and that changes over time. And part of the government's strategy is to explore that through these kind of multiple conflicting objectives. And then having a deadline of any kind, whether it's an electoral deadline or a 5-year plan deadline, creates a kind of rush to the end. And anyone who has deadlines coming up, which is probably all of us, will know this feeling well. But in China, most recent 5-year plan was coming to an end. Provinces weren't making their energy efficiency targets, so they shut off power plants to be able to get there at the last minute, right? So short-termism is not a unique problem to democracies and elections. It's a systematic characteristic, I think, of complex organizations and states being very much one of them. And the tools to manage it are multiple, and there's some good ones in China to learn from, some great ones in other parts of the world to also learn from.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Geoff, this one came in for you, but again, open to the panel. Owen O'Mahony, from the Department of An Taoiseach, our Prime Minister here. How can we begin to develop the methodologies needed to enable intergenerational policy making and budgets? And related to that is a question in from my colleague here, Gráinne Collins. The Programme for Government commits to a new unit for future planning to forecast demographic changes. What advice do you have for the people setting this up? So just very light questions coming in, Geoff.
Well, on the finance side, I think good finance ministers need to be making the first tentative steps. And I can be very boring on this, but I think there are things you can start doing on applying investment models to social spending and education. The data isn't quite there yet to do it systematically, but you can make a first step, and ensuring your government is actually keep collecting the impact data. So over time, you can take this longer time horizon. You can do the first sketchy work on broader balance sheets, and you should be doing that anyway. And already the IMF and others look on intergenerational finance, but only looking at kind of the fiscal and pensions issues, not at other ones. So I think there's a lot beginning to happen in governments. They couldn't, through the pandemic and the crises, it was very hard to get the head above the water. But now, when it may not feel like it, a slightly more stable period, when I think modernizing the basic mechanisms is absolutely essential. Otherwise, your finance tools work against your political priorities. If you're taking an investment approach just to physical stuff and not to humans, which are a much bigger area of public spending and more important to the public. For the new office, there's a whole array of methods and tools, again, on how to do strategy. The key for them, though, is to align closely, again, to political priorities, to be working, I would say, always on commission to a minister as well as the Taoiseach on very specific problem solving. The mistake I've often seen these teams around the world do is they do very broad sort of foresight scenarios exercise, very sort of paper-based, and it's not actually very useful to decisions in the present. And then they don't tend to survive. So be useful, be focused, really triage the topics. And maybe just one final comment on China. I've worked quite a lot in China and taught for many years at their sort of training academy for ministers and governors. There was a time they were definitely far more impressive than us on their long-term planning through the State Council, NDRC, all sorts of institutions. But I absolutely agree with Tom. There's no automatic law which says autocrats are more long-term than democrats. Individual autocrats tend not to be, because all they care about is their own time horizon. And if they're 80, what do they care about the future? China was a partial counterexample because the Communist Party does have a long time horizon for itself. But as we've seen with monopoly political parties, they also get captured by corruption and predatory behaviors which work against what should be their incentive to have a much longer term time horizon than a political party which is just worried about the next election. So it's a much more complex issue, and overall the sort of lazy view that the autocracies will win the 21st century because they're longer term is a lazy view which doesn't actually fit the facts.
Thank you so much for that. Muiris, Thomas?
Yeah, I mean, just small observations that an awful lot, and again, maybe this is peculiar to Western democracies, but a huge amount of government spending is annualized. It's fixed. It's it's salaries, and it's running the hospitals and the schools. So often governments appear to have a very little wiggle room, or discretion in terms of like, well, what can we do differently this year? But I was just listening to Geoff and Tom. It thought crossed my mind that actually, quite a bit of government spending is already for the long term. Like taking money out of public servants' salaries, for example, putting them into pensions. That's in effect a long term planning. Some public infrastructure is long term planning. So there might be an interesting thought would be, well, what just to put a very simple view, this would be what percentage of government spending is in a sort of 30-year plus horizon and what is not, and could you shift the proportion of that in innovative ways towards more and more of government spending, even if it is annualized, is with a view to the longer term as opposed to the short term. Now that applies across everything like agriculture, transport, industrial innovation, you name it. But maybe something like that would be a good starting point as well, about thinking, well, how much money are we just spending that is the character of it is longer term. Now whether it's appropriate or not is a different question as well. But in terms of just thinking about the quantum that's spent on short term things, sorry, there's a bit of feedback. Yeah.
And of course we have the two funds. We have the Future Ireland Fund, and we have the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund, and there's 10 billion, I think, between the two, moving on to 16 billion into next year. So certainly there's a lot of scope there as well. Thomas, if I can come to you just for any comment.
Yeah, can I pick up on this thread? So in my country, the United States, we're about to have a change of government, as many people might have noticed. And one of the stated goals of this new government is to create increased efficiency by having some tech billionaires help the government think about how to save money. And when people talk about efficiency in government, they often confuse two ideas. One is less is automatically more, with the kind of as an ideology, which is different from a kind of how do we actually get more for less, which is what I might think is a more accurate definition of efficiency. I think it's most likely that Elon Musk is more in the first category, but assuming you were trying to get good value for money in government, then considering the time horizon is absolutely essential. The biggest thing the United States government spent money on in the last few years is response to COVID, over $5 trillion in spending on very wasteful things like trying to buy masks and PPE at scale with huge waste and inefficiency around it. And this is not, of course, unique to the United States. But the amount of money we spent on pandemic prevention and resilience is hard actually to measure. We don't have a great measure of what exactly counts or not, but on the order of a few billion per year. And that's not atypical. So if you were really serious about long-term, about efficiency as a government, you have to think about efficiency over what time frame. And if you're not making kinds of sensible investments like in pandemic prevention, or indeed in early childhood education, or health, preventive health interventions, then you're really not serious about efficiency in terms of actually shrinking the size of government. And I think even if you're doing it only for ideological reasons, which is probably true in this incoming case, you're not going to succeed unless you take this challenge seriously. So I think there's a real time component to some of the fundamental challenges governments are facing on the fiscal front.
Thank you so much for that. I see Geoff has his hand back up.
Just very quickly on this point of Thomas and Muiris. So 3 or 4 years ago, this is exactly what we tried doing with the UAE and some others, where you would map all of public spending with the time horizon of intended impacts, everything from education to investment in science to infrastructures and pensions. And also, as Thomas has said, you've got to be very clear what you're trying to achieve with that money over time. And in a way, that's normal in business. That's what you do. If you're running a pharmaceutical company, that's exactly what you do with your whole portfolio of different drugs on different time horizons and investment. But almost no governments do it. And therefore, they can't learn very well about what impacts are or are not achieved. And they don't have the right kind of conversation about priority setting. So this seems to me absolutely, core to what should be modern public finance, but literally not a single finance ministry around the world has yet really done what you both described. And therefore that risks what I call boomerang cuts, for example, where you cut something in 1 year, but it creates lots of costs in 3 or 4 years' time. It is difficult. And the big shifts of spending, if you look at the EU level, in the last 5 years. One was the big shift to net zero spending, which definitely was a long-term shift, and then the other to defence spending. And of course, with defence spending, it is quite hard to say what your time horizon of desired impact is. So there'll be fuzziness around the edges, but these are exactly the right questions to be asking in my view.
Geoff, can you say one more word about why it didn't maybe take off in the UAE, which would seem to be a most likely case for those kinds of ideas to be advanced?
Well, it was the timing. We were doing it in the middle of the pandemic when every finance ministry was living hand to mouth. We had good engagement from the OECD and IMF and others, and I was hoping we'd get the Danes, the Finns, some of the other countries are very interested. It's still quite difficult. I mean, their pushback in the last few months, I've been having these conversations again, is we don't quite have enough data or knowledge to do the tagging. But I say you should still start. And what's interesting about things like impact bonds is they do try and at least force you to be much more precise about how spending in 2025 might lead to some both direct return for your department and indirect savings perhaps for another department in 2027 or 2030. And is this mental frame, I think, is what we need. And then around it, there's a whole sort of method and capability. If anyone on this call knows where this is being done well, please share examples.
Thank you so very much for that. Geoff, if I can ask you just a point of clarity for Patrick Taylor before we go to Rona's question. Can I ask Geoff, was it the Atlantic switcher he mentioned that will impact temperatures on these islands?
Yeah, it's the risk of basically the Gulf Stream turning off. And there's been a lot of analysis of it. There was actually a very good summary just a few days ago, somewhere, I can't remember where it was. And people don't know. It could happen in 20 years, it could happen in 80 years. The risk seems to be getting worse quite rapidly because of the various dynamics of ice melting and so on. And if it does happen, I think your average temperature will go down, was it 2 or 3 degrees? So you'll basically be, you'll have the same climate as your equivalents on the Newfoundland, the other side of the Atlantic. So it will have very, very big impacts on Ireland and Britain. And there's probably not much we can do about it now, but at the very least we should try to be prepared and to be monitoring it systematically. And if it does look like it's beginning to happen, and it could happen in 2 or 3 years, or it could be a 10, 20-year time horizon, that then there's action to reshape all of our institutions, our buildings and so on. Otherwise it'll be a bit miserable for our kids.
Thank you so much for that. The next question came in from Dr. Rona Dempsey. It came in during your presentation, Thomas, so I might go to you first, if that's okay. What role should policymakers have in considering societal and attitudinal shifts that may be required in tandem with policy advances? For example, around disability and care. The word care is quite a loaded word and somewhat removed from the need to promote and encourage the rights of citizens as per the UN CRPD. Thank you.
Thanks. So I think in terms of long problems generally, if people have, the writer Roman Karnovich is very visceral metaphor for this. So he says we have a marshmallow brain and an acorn brain, and this is a sort of crude summary of behavioral science. But there are plenty of people who can't, save money, can't discipline themselves to give off a little bit of a short-term benefit for long-term benefit, and those same people can, at the very same time, save for their children's future or to make choices that are in their long-term interest. So human psychology is very has both directions, and so how do we encourage and nudge people toward the better choice is a big area of work. And so I think those kinds of it shows, Ron, I think that the kind of social norms and behavioral practices are really important for actually equipping society to address long problems more effectively, both at the global scale, at the societal scale, and also in our individual lives. And so I think we should think very hard about things like the best example I can think of is when I was a student in primary school, we all had to sing every morning a song about how we were never going to smoke cigarettes. Like every school child had, and I could still sing this song today. And the long-term fiscal benefit of that is enormous, right? This sort of silly little song was very much part of a wide societal shift to reduce smoking. Now, vaping, let's leave vaping aside for now, but this is a huge public health win, right? To move children in a generational sense away from cigarettes. So I think it can be very powerful.
We may get you to sing that song during the break. So thank you for that. If I can ask the same question of Muiris and Geoff.
Sorry, the question disappeared there. Actually, I was but just in respect of care, I think is very interesting. When care is again as a distinct policy area, speaks very much, as Geoff mentioned, this idea of people living longer and so on. There's a lot of excitement, I guess, around the artificial intelligence and digital and so on. I have some colleagues here in Queens who work on this, and we're, you can be very skeptical about it. That I'm not sold myself on robot nurses and so on. If you find yourself in hospital or needing care, but I think you're right that again, back to the point that's been made on a couple of occasions, thinking about what a particular concept means in the future and how it will differ from today. Like, what will transport policy mean in 50 years' time? If people had been asked that in 1925, I mean, they wouldn't have conceived of what we have today. But similarly, looking forward, what will care mean? And I mean, there is a whole question about what being human will mean in 50 years' time or 100 years' time, which relates to that. So, sorry, a slightly disorganized answer to that, but I think these are, as Geoff says, precisely the type of questions, and events like this are very, very useful, I think, for promoting thinking on these.
Yeah, all I'd add to this, in a way, all of these issues depend on what society sees, what we take, what we notice, the things we care about, rather than what governments necessarily do. So looking at an economy in terms of carbon is a dramatically different way of thinking about an economy than what was normal 30 or 40 years ago. And so you have to sort of change your attitudes, your perspectives, before you can then have a shift of politics and policy. Mental health is another example. You know, in the mid 20th century, that was not really thought to be a job of governments or policy. It was more sort of private matter, except at the very extremes. And now it's increasingly recognized. And actually, future mental health becomes then an crucial issue for everything from, you know, social media and technology policy to teaching kids how to handle their own well-being. And I think care's, you know, absolutely in this space. Spain, I think, is about to introduce a right to care. I think it's the first country in Europe sort of trying to turn it into a formal right. Now, maybe you would say that's the wrong language. They sort of tried this a couple of years ago and didn't quite have the capacity to respond. But I think shifting care into the kind of rights language in a way that did happen for health and education will over time completely change the structure of the discussion and the debate. And to me, that's entirely healthy. That's what, you know, that's what progress is all about. But almost everything we look at in a time horizon with temporality depends on what things we care about, what things we attend to, because our brains, they may be marshmallows and acorns, but they also have very limited capacity. There's not many things we can keep in mind at the same time. So perhaps the question always is, what are the 5 or 10 things which really matter in terms of our legacy to future generations, and which ones, yeah, maybe not quite so much.
Great, thank you so much. We have a comment in from Tom Ferris. Thank you, Tom. Responding to getting value for money. The Programme for Government yesterday has an interesting inclusion, and it's a website that's been up there for quite some time. It'll promote the Where Your Money Goes website so that citizens are informed as to how their money is being spent. And that breaks down spending for individual departments and individual programs as well. So it's an interesting one for those of you who may be interested in that aspect of the budgeting. Thank you.
Although, could I just come in that an interesting feature about those things are often produced by governments, and the heaviest users are often civil servants. Like, I'd love to know how many members. I could be completely wrong in this. I just know it's true often with open data, that when open data started and government saying, look at all the stuff we're doing, it was actually people working in government were the heaviest users of it. So I would love to know the figures on how many citizens sit down and have a look and go through that type of thing.
Well, perhaps the Programme for Government's initiative around promoting it a little bit more will generate a bit more interest in it. But absolutely, I mean, I myself would have a look at it regularly enough, but it is definitely an interesting resource that is there. So it is now coming up to time to stop for our break. I would like to thank so very, very much Professors Muiris, MacCarthaigh, Geoff, Mulgan and Thomas Hale for their incredible presentations. I have so many questions that I didn't get to ask myself. So please, don't be too disappointed if you get many emails in relation to that. The slides from this morning's presentations will be available, as will the recording, just in the coming weeks. So with that, I would like to thank everybody. Thank you so much to Martha for organising as well. We're going to take a half-hour break, and then we will be back with our next chair, Cathal, and our next round of speakers for the second session. Thank you so very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Klaus.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. My name is Cathal O'Donoghue. I'm from the University of Galway, and with a great earlier session, a really important question, how to manage the big long-term questions that we face as societies. So thanks to Colette for chairing and the fantastic presentations from the previous speakers. In this, the second session, we're going to look at 3 different dimensions. So looking a deeper dive on a specific long-term policy question in relation to climate, looking at mechanisms for doing long-term policy in relation to foresight, and taking a European perspective. So same format as this morning. If you've got questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A during the session, and we'll have a question and answer session after the three presentations. So the first presenter is Rhiannon Hardiman, who's from the Office of the Future Generations Bishop of Wales, and she's had a variety of different development roles in local and national government, and will present a paper, Planning for Climate Futures. Over to you, Rhiannon.
Great, thank you. Just going to share my screen. Okay, is that come up okay?
Yeah, looks good to me.
Great, okay. So I'm here to talk about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that we have in Wales, which this year will be 10 years old. And this is the legislation which has created the role of Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, Derek Walker. And his role is there to give that voice to people who are not born yet, people who don't currently exist, that we heard about in the first session earlier today. On a practical level, the Commissioner's role is there really to support, challenge public sector organisations in Wales to really understand and deliver all of those different elements that we have within the legislation, which I will run through in just a moment. Now, the Commissioner's term is 7 years. This is very deliberately outside of political cycles. And Derek is our second Commissioner, following Sophie Howe, who was the first to hold that role. And Derek has published his strategy for his 7 years in office. It's called Cymru Can, and it's a mission-based strategy. And you can learn all about that. That link on the screen will take you to that. So I'll just run through a little bit more about the legislation itself. So what the Wellbeing Act intended to do at the time was to take the Sustainable Development Goals and put those onto a statutory footing in Wales in a way that made sense for the Welsh people. So very much based on the Sustainable Development Principle. So absolutely we're about delivering for people today, but thinking longer term, so that we're considering now what the impact of our decisions and actions will be longer term to make sure that there's a positive impact for people in the future. We found that's not typically how public sector organisations work, largely working within limitations of tight budgets, etc. You know, we often see bodies in the position of just firefighting, trying to tackle problems now, and it's quite difficult really for those organisations to really have the headspace to think about reducing the chances of the same sort of problems they're dealing with now from happening again in future. So this is why we have the legislation, is to try and find the way to shift that mindset within public bodies so that they are thinking in that way. And we are now starting to see those changes coming through. And the challenge for us really is getting all of that good thinking off the page and into practice. So I'll just show you the what the sort of infrastructure, the architecture of the Act looks like. There's quite a lot of information on here, but you can have a look at it when the slides are shared. So what you can see across the top there, those coloured boxes, those are the 7 wellbeing goals that we have in Wales. And they are focused on prosperity, ecological resilience, becoming a more healthier Wales, a more equal Wales, having cohesive communities. And we also focus on cultural well-being and the language, as well as Wales being a globally responsible player in the world. So those are the goals that we've set through an 18-month-long involvement exercise that we did those 10 years ago. And these goals are to see us through to that 2050 milestone. And how we're tracking that is through 50 national indicators. Some of those have milestones attached to them. And those indicators, progress against those is tracked annually. The Welsh Government will publish the Wellbeing of Wales report every year, so we can see how we're doing against those national indicators. And I'm afraid to say it's not the best picture at the moment. So there's still a lot of work to do to try and push those forward. Then in terms of the making it happen on this slide, we have public bodies who mainly have the duties under the Act to set objectives, which are well-being objectives. These are not in addition to other objectives that the organisation might have. These are the core objectives of the local authority or whatever body that is. Their corporate business plan strategy will all be centred around well-being objectives, which will all aim to achieve these well-being goals. Public services boards are something which is established through the legislation, and public services boards bring together, usually on a local authority footprint, all the local authorities, health boards, fire and rescue, natural resources bodies, all these different public sector organisations. They will come together, meet regularly, and they have a duty under the Act every 5 years to undertake a wellbeing assessment for their territory, for their area. And from that wellbeing assessment, they will then develop a wellbeing plan. So it's all about collaborating across all those different organisations, looking at how you can identify synergies, who's working on what, how can you identify those interdependencies and really drive forward the ambition for these goals together. The 5 ways of working, I'll pick those up in just a second, but those really are essential part of this architecture in terms of how we make the Act work. And just briefly, we work alongside the Auditor General for Wales as well in terms of that scrutiny and ongoing support and challenge to those organisations that fall under the legislation. So these are those organisations. These new ones on the bottom, they joined, they came into legislation this year. So we have around 56 public organisations in Wales who have a duty under the Wellbeing Act. Okay, so the 5 ways of working. This is where we really see the Act really taking shape and coming off the page. So the 5 ways of working: integration, long-term, prevention, as well as involvement and collaboration. What these are in theory is a how-to of how to deliver sustainable development. Now, in Wales, these are specifically in the legislation as how we should be making any decisions when it comes to public policy and public spending. And the first 3 of them, you could say these are sort of the mindset shifts that we really need to embody. So integration, this is about acknowledging that whatever issue we are dealing with in our organisation or team, it's going to have impacts for other issues, other policy areas, other organisations. So integration is all about trying to find out what those are and attempting to join the dots. So that might be integrating strategies, it might be integrating policy, it could be different pieces of legislation, how they interact with each other. And it's also integration across those wellbeing goals, so that whatever we're doing to deliver against one goal, we're making sure that we're either supporting the achievement of the other goals, or we're at least are not doing any harm towards achieving those other goals. So it's all about unlocking those synergies, those interdependencies. Then you have long-term thinking. Now, this is about having that vision way into the future. So the legislation asks for long-term vision to be at least 10 years. In practice, we're encouraging it to be more like 25 years. But actually, we have some really good examples in Wales where it's much longer than that. So, for example, we have a National Infrastructure Commission in Wales, and they've given themselves an 80-year timeline. So that commission will do pieces of work, for example, looking at renewable energy needs in Wales. It's looking at flood risk from climate change, and it's giving that 80-year perspective right through to 2100 and beyond. And then we have prevention, which is really key and really well connected to long-term thinking. So prevention is all about trying to prevent problems from happening rather than trying to fix them. And we've heard a lot this morning about budget setting, and this is really where, it's a really sticky issue. The national budget in Wales, half of it goes towards the health service. That's majority of that is towards frontline services. It's acute spending. It's fixing problems. So how do we change that mindset, that thinking, that forward planning? So we're actually starting to shift focus, shift priority more to those things which prevent us from becoming ill in the first place. So when we're talking about that, we're talking about all those things which are the wider determinants of health around where you live, your work, your social connections. All of those things are really important. So that's where we're currently trying to do a lot more work with Welsh Government to try and help prevention be pushed further up the agenda. And to do that, we've agreed a definition of prevention. We break it down: primary, secondary, tertiary prevention. So you're either trying to prevent problems before they've even happened, or you're trying to create the conditions where problems don't occur or get worse. And then the other two ways of working then are really around how we work with other people. So the collaboration way of working, as I mentioned before, creates the public services boards, and that's a really key example that we have in Wales. And actually those public services boards are now actually starting to think a lot more around climate and are doing their own climate risk assessments as well. But it's really about listening, it's really about collaborating, uniting forces, and really trying to tackle those long-term challenges with other people in the room beyond those usual partners. Involvement is quite different to collaboration. Involvement is more about understanding who is going to be impacted by your policy decisions, your budget decisions, whatever those are. So this is not about going out to consultation. It's much more than that. It's about dialogue. It's about really being open to change. And meaningful involvement is actually where you actually are engaging with those stakeholders from the problem right through to planning and right through to delivery as well. So that's what we're also encouraging right across the public sector, to really identify ways that you can do this more meaningfully. So there are examples like participatory budgeting, for example, things like citizens' assemblies. All of these things now, we're hearing a lot more about these across various organisations. So I was asked today to reflect on climate change policy. And this is one of my main areas of work with the Commissioner's Office. And when it comes to the climate emergency, for us, we think about the climate and nature emergency as one, which needs one response. And that really speaks to that integration way of working. But when you're looking at climate change in terms of those 7 well-being goals, you can see that actually integration is so much more than that. So it could be thinking about the impact of your actions or your decisions on other sectors, entirely different industry, different demographics, protected characteristics, and it can even be thinking about places on the other side of the world as well. So to pick an example from what's on here, if we found that we thought climate risk was too much of a threat to food production, or we thought that decarbonising our food production in Wales, our food supply chain, is just too difficult, why don't we just import it? Let's just import our soy. Problem solved. Well, actually, all you're doing there is offshoring your carbon footprint and your climate impacts for somebody else to deal with. And in particular, in that case, we'd be contributing to deforestation. So immediately, we're not being globally responsible. So actually, that isn't the right solution. And we know that the IPCC has said that to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, we have to halt and reverse tropical deforestation. And actually, there's a movement in Wales now some of our schools in the county of Monmouthshire to become deforestation free. So the school menu is a deforestation free menu. So really some really good initiatives coming through. Another example when it comes to decarbonisation is green tech in industries. You know, we might want to move faster. We might want to shift our industries to using green tech much more quickly. But in doing that, you actually risk leaving communities behind. You actually risk unemployment levels rising, unrest increasing in communities. And there's an example of this issue coming up in Wales only last year with a blast furnace at Port Talbot Steelworks, where UK government had made the decision to shut down a coal-fired blast furnace and replace it with an electric arc alternative. And while that might be the right solution in terms of decarbonisation and climate change, the process that was followed didn't really take the time to plan for the longer term impact of that decision. It didn't involve workers in making that decision. And also there was a real lack of collaboration or listening to what the unions were saying as well. And if we continue working in that vein, we're not going to get that popular support from communities to back everything we need to do to shift us more quickly towards that net zero. And the narrative, it becomes net zero decarbonisation is a bad thing. So that's a narrative that we're really keen to shift into a more positive news story. And the way you do that is through that involvement and that engagement with more people. So climate policy in Wales, it's quite a lot that does touch on climate, and all of these different policies, bits of legislation that I've got on this slide. Many of these are actually interconnected, the links are being made between them. Some of them, the Wellbeing Act, Planning Act and the Environment Wales Act, when they were written, they were intended to be used in tandem together. So this is the kind of integration that we're looking for right at the top level of making law in Wales. Now, bringing it back to practicalities, the Climate Change Committee, it looks at progress in Wales. It publishes a report specifically for Wales on how we're doing against our carbon budgets. And they've told us Wales is not going fast enough. And as part of that, they've told us that Wales is not using its policy levers to full effect. So these are the areas that we have devolved responsibility mainly. And a few of the things that it said we need to do better are faster at tree planting, peatland restoration, and putting in EV infrastructure. But they also looked at climate adaptation, but they found a real lack of data in Wales, which is actually holding them back from being able to do a full assessment. And there's all sorts of resourcing and budgeting issues around that, but that's a whole different issue. But in terms of those decarb, that advice, let's have a look at what that means. So tree planting and peatland restoration in Wales. So 80% or so of the land that we have in Wales, of the total land, is agricultural. So to be able to move faster on those two things, we're actually relying on cooperation with the farming community in Wales. Now, since the RDP stopped being in existence in the UK, Wales has been developing an alternative, sustainable farming scheme, and it's been a real hot potato, a real political issue. We've had protests at the Senedd. It really hasn't gone down very well. And what that scheme is trying to do is to find that balance between prosperity and cohesion in our rural communities, while also moving us as fast as possible towards decarbonisation and also nature recovery. And it really reached an impasse last year where it was pulled back. So there's been a much more in-depth involvement exercise happening now over 12 months to really engage farmers, to really listen to their concerns, and actually together to work through it and to find a way that works. And so it does look like now that scheme will get off the ground. Not going to be as ambitious as it was originally, but a start is better than nothing, and it means that we can crack on. So the other issue that the Climate Change Committee said that we weren't working fast enough was in terms of EV infrastructure. So it would be something I'd really like to talk about is transport policy in Wales, because that's somewhere where the Future Generations Act has actually had quite a big impact already. Now, this quote comes from a report that our office published a few years ago. And what this is really saying is, okay, when it comes to transport, let's think to the long term. Let's create that vision. Let's decide what we want Wales to be like in the future. And then let's create the transport infrastructure that will get us to that point. So it's as much about placemaking as it is about, you know, trying to move people around and getting people to work. And one area where the Act had a really big influence in overturning a decision was a decision to build a motorway relief road right through South Wales on the M4, which would have cut through a triple SI, through the Gwent levels, a haven for nature. Now, if that had gone ahead, it would have been completely against the Resilient Wales goal, which requires us to build up ecosystems resilience. We found it would have provided very little benefit to the people living locally, who are not the ones who are causing the excess traffic, and would not be benefiting from that relief road. So it would be going against the more equal Wales goal as well. And ultimately, and there have been lots of studies that have shown this, if you build more road space, what happens in the long term is that you actually encourage more car use. So what this means is that that relief road would have been a short-term benefit only, and it would have had an investment of 1.4 billion going into that. So where we have these really, really big decisions, financial decisions to make, we have to really think long and hard about what impact that spend is going to have longer term. And so that decision was overturned, and instead now what we're focusing more on is creating better public transport and active travel infrastructure, and a really unapologetic drive to get people out of their cars long term. So we're looking at things like metro, we're looking at electrification of train lines, looking at train timetables, moving to that sort of turn up and go that you get on London Underground infrastructure, for example. We're looking at the return of tram trains in our cities in Wales. We're really driving forward active travel in Wales. We have a separate Active Travel Act for that, which involves engaging communities in planning for the active travel infrastructure that they want and need 15 years ahead from now with that longer term view. Active travel features in our obesity strategy in Wales, Healthy Weight, Healthy Wales. It's really trying to drive forward that change in behaviour, that modal shift in transport, driving that through all these different places. We also have a bus bill coming up in Wales, which would see integration across all modes of public transport in Wales, which is a really exciting development. So one ticket would take you across all different modes of transport. Timetabling would actually be coordinated, which it really isn't now. Lots of positive changes coming with that. And just finally, I'll just close on this slide here, which again emphasizes the difference that we now have in terms of how we're making policy in Wales. So on the left, we have planning policy in Wales, which shows the hierarchy now that transport planners need to be thinking about when they're developing a place, a new neighbourhood, whatever that is. Walking and cycling has to come first. You have to find the space for that provision first. You have to factor in public transport next, and so on, with private car use as being the lowest priority. The Wales Transport Strategy, on the column on the right, you can really see here that the focus of the transport strategy is not your classic, how do we get more people from A to B as fast as possible, the most efficient, quickest way. That's really not what it's about in Wales. In Wales, it's more about how do we prevent the need for people to travel around? How can we make it easier for people to access everything they need closer to home? And how do we actually encourage people to shift to more sustainable forms of transport? So when you come back to that question around EV charging infrastructure, yes, we have an EV strategy and action plan, and yes, we are working on putting that infrastructure in Wales. But ultimately, it's not part of that long-term vision to that extent, because EV infrastructure essentially is a short-term fix. It is a way of propping up the business as usual situation of everyone owning private cars. And that in itself is really unsustainable longer term, because already we are overrun in our streets with cars looking for places to park. Makes it really unsafe. Parents don't feel happy walking their children to school because of all the cars everywhere. You may have picked up on the change of default speed limit in Wales around all our residential streets from a 30 to a 20. All of that is coming off the back of this drive to encourage more healthy, more active lifestyles, reduce our carbon emissions, and actually create communities which are much nicer places to live, and people speak to each other more as well. So I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take any questions after. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rhiannon. And as you were reporting on the details that the climate report that was written for Wales, it could be written for Ireland. And I guess we have a common issue, and we often know what to do. So we have plenty of strategies, but making it happen and making it happen fast enough is a challenge for our government system. So thanks very much for that. Our next speaker is Laurie Smith, who's head of foresight research in NESTA, which is the UK's innovation agency for social good, and has a career in the Royal Society and the Academy of Medical Sciences. He is going to make a presentation in for the long haul. Over to you, Laurie.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for having me. I'm just going to share my screen, which might involve a bit of fiddling around. Is that working? I can't see.
It's on the way, I think. Here we go.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's working. Lovely. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think Kathl's provided introduction, so I probably don't need to go through that. What am I going to talk about? Well, I'm going to talk about three things. First is a bit of an introduction to NESTA and its discovery team, which is the team I sit in at NESTA. Secondly, is to talk about a piece of work we did a couple of years ago called Minister for the Future. And thirdly, is chat a little bit about how to encourage long-termism in government. I'm acutely aware that Geoff Mulgan's on the call, who used to run NESTA and also very kindly contributed to the Minister for the Future project. But hopefully that will provide me with some accountability, so I can't just go making things up, because you know what really happened. So I'll go to the next slide. So I work for NESTA, which is the UK's innovation agency for social good, and we design, test and scale new solutions to society's biggest problems. And I suppose, like the Future Generation Commissioner's Office, we're a mission-driven organisation, and we focus on three missions around promoting a fairer start, so that's reducing early years childhood inequality, helping people live healthier lives, which is largely about tackling obesity, and trying to maybe you can have a more sustainable future, sort of tackling household carbon emissions, particularly from household heating. And I suppose NESTA and the Discovery Hub have a long track record of thinking about the future, going back into Geoff's time. So there might be stuff even before this, but here's a little timeline. There's so back in 2013, there was a piece that a former colleague of mine, Jess Bland, and Stian Westlake, who now runs ESRC, which is a research council in the UK, did, called Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow, where they sort of made the case of futures thinking. We had a really fantastic festival called Future Fest, which is sort of mass public engagement with really interesting conversations about the future and politics and society and technology. We do methodological experimentation. So there's work around, say, the future of work that combined data-driven horizon scanning and strategic foresight. We did a whole bunch of work around tech futures, around the future of the internet and anticipatory regulation. And also done work around participatory futures, so which I was involved with. Try to involve the public in conversations about the future, because often it can be dominated by corporations or governments. So we want to bring sort of citizens in there as well. I'm sort of trying to give some sense of where we at least think we sit among some of our peers. So as any good consultant would do, I've created a bit of a matrix which sort of shows, I suppose, a sort of one axis of public or sort of social features and one private or corporate features on the y-axis, on the x-axis, sort of academic versus sort of mainstream culture. And I suppose sort of discovery and NESTA, there's a little D in the top, is definitely on the public and social side. And I suppose we're somewhere in between the academic and the mainstream side. So we do some very sort of fairly public-facing work and some more academic work. You can see where, at least I think, some of our peers sit, but they might think differently. It gives a rough sense of the field, particularly in the UK. And I work in NESTA. I work in something called the Discovery Hub, which I suppose can be seen, a little metaphor we use is it's sort of NESTA's test kitchen, a bit like Ottolenghi has a test kitchen. Maybe it's slightly pretentious comparing ourselves to Ottolenghi. I'm sure we're not that talented, but essentially apparently it's got a test kitchen where ideas are tried out. Some are popped into the main restaurant menus, but others, things don't work out and you sort of learn a bit from them. And we're supposed to be sort of focused on three things. We do a bit of work around scanning and scoping. So we've got a whole set of horizon scanning work and work with our missions, looking at the future and the edges of our missions. We do a bunch of sort of capacity building work. So we've done a lot of work on building capacity around generative AI at NESTA and residencies. We've brought experts into the organisation. And we did a little bit of thought leadership. So we did some signals this year. It's got a little bit of media attention, which was fun. We did something called Tech in the Dock, where we put technology and have a sort of simulated court case around it. And something I'm going to talk about in a bit is a piece of work called Minister for the Future. Who's in the Discovery Hub? There's a whole sort of bunch of us, and we've got a whole different skill sets. There's lots of people who know about strategic foresight, emerging technologies, data science, comms, design, qual research, and program management and other skill sets. So really a sort of interdisciplinary team. So the project I'm going to start talking about is Minister for the Future. And back in 2022, NESTA and the current affairs magazine Prospect created a fictitious Minister for the Future. And the idea was to fashion an imaginative way of surfacing novel solutions to knotty long-term problems. And because there are no simple solutions to multifaceted challenges, we included several proposals for every topic. We weren't trying to create a single coherent manifesto. Instead, we wanted to create a platform for others' ideas that allowed us to showcase a wide range of novel proposals. Now, to fill up the minister's red box with actionable ideas, we assembled world-leading academics, scientists, campaigners, and business leaders, including Geoff, among others. And together, they brought sort of deep expertise, a bit of left-field thinking, and unique insight into the way the future would unfold. And so beneath the conceit lies a serious point. We feel sort of political attention is fixated quite a lot on managing the present. As Geoff said, it can do some long-term thinking. Governments can do some long-term thinking. I suppose you've got examples like the Future Generations Commission and, sort of education. We do feel that political discourse on the left and right is often backward-looking and sort of focuses on the urgent and the important. And we also sort of thought that the great sort of social and physical infrastructure projects of the past, like the welfare state or London's victorious sewers, were sparked by initial idea. You didn't have a fully comprehensive plan. You sort of started with a seed of idea, which sort of grew from somewhere. We hope this collection would help people feel that the features are malleable rather than fixed. And I suppose for the minister idea, we took inspiration from countries like Wales, like the Future Generation Commissioner's Office, like Sweden and Hungary have had similar-ish sort of roles. And we also owe a debt to authors, so people like Kurt Vonnegut, who proposed a Secretary of State for the Future in the US back in 2005, and Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote a science fiction book you might have encountered called Ministry for the Future. So what sort of ideas and solutions are we after? Well, inspired in part by the work of the UK's Institute for Government, we set 3 criteria for the sort of challenges we want to go after. We wanted the benefits and costs to be unevenly distributed over time. We wanted there to be a significant degree of uncertainty about how an issue will manifest. And we also wanted things where there's sustained action or investment would be needed over time to show significant results. And we wanted to sort of really consider challenges of the future where trends collide, so things come together, like let's say the future of food, where you're looking at costs, security, sort of environmental issues. So we chose 8 themes that would dominate any real Minister of the Future's red box. An example of this might be, how can we plan for the labour market, which is simultaneously being rocked by the aftermath of Brexit in the UK, the green transition and automation. Now, for our solutions, we set 5 criteria. We wanted ideas that were timely, ambitious and novel. We wanted things that were specific and technically possible, even if politically challenging. We wanted stuff that would be deliverable within the space of a generation, so sort of 30 years old. One of the things that were designed with intergenerational fairness in mind, that I think Thomas mentioned this morning, and others have as well. And we wanted things that are sort of broadly within the powers and responsibilities of the UK national, regional or sort of local governments. And what we really wanted were to focus on specific practical actions, even if those ideas are radical or provocative. We feel that too often policy debate is excessively focused on diagnosis and not enough on interventions. I'm sure you've read many, many non-fiction books where there's 95% is sort of looking around the problem, and there's a little chapter at the end that often the editors insisted on that actually has some solutions. So examples of sort of proposals were creating a loneliness levy on self-service checkouts, a little like the levy you've got on plastic bags in the UK, or establishing a psychological defence agency to pre-bunk fake news in a similar way to they've created in Sweden. Of course, our criteria were only guidelines. Our real goal was to surface novel ideas for solutions to long-term challenges. Now, we published the initial collection in a special issue of Prospect magazine back in December 2022. And the idea seemed to capture the imagination of potential contributors. So we had former Chief Medical Officer, Professor Dame Sally Davis, Chief Medical Officer for the UK, chef and founder of the restaurant chain Wahacker. I don't know if they're in Ireland, but there's a lady called Thomasina Mears who did that. Science fiction author and internet campaigner Cory Doctorow, and of course Geoff, among many others. And we had 24 proposals across 8 themes. We got pretty good reach, so the publication immediately reached Prospect's 45,000 print subscribers, and NESTA and Prospect's social media efforts were amplified by our contributors and their institutions, so we reached hundreds of thousands of people. And we even got an honourable mention in the Association of Professional Futurists 2023 IF Awards. Now, we got a bit of feedback where our readers sort of said, oh, well, they'd like to dig a bit deeper. So throughout 2023, we held a series of events in collaboration with Prospect. We undertook deep dives into some of the proposals. So here you can see Thomasina Mears discussing her proposal about the future of food with farmer Tom Martin and Oxford academic Tara Garrett, and they're being interviewed by Prospect editor and former Guardian editor Alan Rusbridger. And together, these events have been attended in person by hundreds of people. Now, as the Minister for the Future project was about showcasing solutions, but we're not necessarily proposing that the UK or any other country should actually have a Minister of the Future. We're not against the idea either. We just don't know yet. But questions from the readers of our collection and attendees at our events got us thinking about what might be the best way of encouraging futures thinking in government. And countless reports and committees, I'm sure you've all seen, have called on government to think more long term. But how might that happen in practice when so many of the incentives push in the other direction? So I suppose instead of sort of well-meaning hand-waving about the need for long-termism, what we need to do, as some of the other speakers have talked about, is alter the structure of policy making so that more anticipatory thinking and action is baked in from the start. So to start a more fulsome conversation about how to make the government more future-facing in practice, we proposed 3 loose categories, which are sort of set out here. And this is an article in a political magazine that sort of try to organise some of these policies. And I realise we've sort of talked about a few frameworks today, and I think from what I've seen, we're all talking. We also lots of what we say sort of resonates with each other. I mean, the way we started was make a big long list of about 100, 120 policies and cluster them all together and work out what are the patterns here. So the first of these clusters is around enfranchising and representing future generations. So perhaps the most democratic way of encouraging future thinking is handing more power to those who will live with the consequences of today's decisions. So eminent political scientist, Professor David Runciman, has actually proposed votes for 6-year-olds. Now, on the face of it, that seems a bit outlandish, but digging deeper, it's a bit harder to be so sure. So, for example, one objection is that children might simply vote the same way as their parents tell them. Yet a very similar argument was made about women being influenced by their husbands when people were discussing women's vote earlier in the 20th century. Trickier than that is, trickier than handing power to younger people is actually representing future generations who haven't even been born yet. And in Japan, an interesting example of this is a chap called Professor Tatsuyoshi Saijo, who's undertaken research on whether people can be encouraged to take the needs of their distant descendants as seriously as their own. And he found that nominating some people involved in who are involved in decision making to represent future generations could lead to better outcomes for those groups. And cities and towns in Japan, such as Uji, Kyoto, and Matsumoto, have started sort of trying out this model. Next, we move to mechanisms. And one example of this is anticipatory regulation that provides a set of behaviours and tools intended to help tackle fast-moving technologies. So examples of this would include the UK Financial Conduct Authority's regulatory sandbox to deal with fintech, or the development of various test beds for autonomous vehicles. Another example is recently the New Zealand government unveiled a wellbeing budget, which is another mechanism. I don't know if it's actually being continued because they had a change of government, but that's sought to better take account of long-term challenges like housing and domestic violence and child poverty. And finally, we've got organisations and bodies. This is where the idea of a Minister for the Future comes in. So a number of countries have experimented with something like this model. So there was a temporary Minister for the Future in Sweden in 2015, and we've also got the Welsh Future Generations Commissioner, who isn't quite a minister but has some similarities. Another example, which I think someone touched on earlier, of sort of long-termist organisations are things like sovereign wealth funds. So Kuwait's got one, UAE's got one, and Norway's got one. There can be some paradoxes there because they often get their money from oil, which can emit carbon dioxide, which might not be so good for the long term. And there was also, although Geoff pointed out there's sort of often a lack of strategy at the heart of government, there are still pockets of sort of foresight strengthening government in the UK, in Canada, in Singapore and elsewhere. One thing I sort of wanted to point out is that long-termism isn't just a progressive project. Conservatives are concerned too. So, for instance, some might argue that economic growth can be stifled by older people voting against changes in planning that might affect their house prices. And politics to encourage long-term thinking can entail some downsides as well. So, for example, independent central banks, which are sort of a mechanism of long-termism, what they do is they often have independence of central banks, which can control interest rates, which can do things like sort of stabilise the economy, because it stops government playing with interest rates for an election to create mini booms that don't necessarily help the economy. So that's part of the intent. But they also take some power from elected officials. But having said that, democracies have long included unelected checks and balances, like, say, independent judiciaries. Now we've got governments in many Western nations are increasingly feel like they're lurching from crisis to crisis, from runaway inflation to COVID. Policymakers often seem focused more on symptoms rather than causes. And sometimes our current model seems to kick the can down the road. Across the globe, we've seen examples of policies that weave long-term thinking into the very fabric of government. And it's about reshaping our whole way of policy making. So to go beyond well-meaning intent to think long-term, we need to understand and identify practical policies that will actually make our systems of government behave in that way. And I think that's me. So we'll move on to questions a bit. I've got, thank you from our imaginary minister. So I will stop sharing and shut up.
That's great. Thanks very much, Laurie. And a very interesting initiative. I guess the with future studies and future conversations, it's often easier to get people to engage in the discussion and they might have a different view until they're faced with the implications for themselves in actual delivery. We'll come back to Q&A there, and just a reminder that if people have questions, if they can put them in the Q&A in the chat, and we'll have time for questions later on. So our final speaker is Professor Klaus Goetz, who's the Professor and Chair in Political Systems and European Integration at the Geschwister Scholl Institute for Political Science at Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich, as a previous appointment for the University of Potsdam and Oxford after PhD in Oxford. And Professor Goetz will give a presentation, The EU, a long-term actor under permanent time pressure. So over to you, Klaus.
Hello, and thank you for the invitation. And we did practice the sharing of the documents earlier on, but for some reason, I seem to have a little problem now.
That's worked. Well, we see something anyway.
We see a
screen. Me, but you don't see a document, no?
No, we see a screen just at the moment.
Oh, that is too bad. As I said, we tried it early on.
Klaus, if you have your the slideshow open first before share. Oh yeah, no, we can see it now.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, just to present mode, Klaus. Yeah. Perfect.
Okay,
yeah,
very good.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to this audience. That is very much appreciated. It is perhaps fitting that presentation on time pressure should be the last on the program. And I'm looking at my watch, and I hope I can stick to the 25 minutes or so that I was allotted, so that we have a chance also for Q&A. What I will be presenting today is a small part of a much larger project, which is funded by the European Research Council, called SyncPol. It is a project which studies synchronized politics in the European Union multi-level system. I'm working on this project with a number of postdocs and doctoral students, and I think two of the postdocs, Radu Triculescu and Christoph Ivanus, should also be in the room. And what I'm presenting is a condensation of one paper that we have worked on in recent months, and which is currently under review, but I'm presenting a much shortened version. Now, our focus is on the European Union and the temporality of the European Union, and we talked this morning a little bit about the different temporalities of different types of political systems. We are looking specifically at the temporal orientations of the European Union. And in this paper, we focus on the Commission, although our overall project tries to understand the temporal orientation both of the European institutions, including the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament, and also selected national institutions and how they interact. And that is a synchronization part of the project. What do you do when different parts of a political system operate according to different time rules and may have different temporal priorities? How do you then synchronize and avoid temporal gridlock? Now, if you think of what people think is the temporal orientation of the European Union, we can distinguish at least three perspectives. The first one, which I think dominated for some time, was that the EU is almost uniquely well placed, at least amongst the European institutions, to act as a long-term political actor. This goes back at least to arguments by Gian Domenico Maggioni about the European Union as a non-majoritarian institution, and I think has carried on in the discussion also more broadly about international organizations. And to put it very crudely and very simply, the argument here is that the European core institutions, in particular the commissions, is to some extent delinked from an electoral cycle, unlike national democratic governments. And that also that it has been delinked, at least in the past, from the vagaries and the volatility of public opinion. And so the argument has been that the European Union is well placed to be a long-term political actor, and some of that literature is nicely summarized in a recent article by Vogel and Rhiannon, which was published in 2023, The EU as a Long-Term Political Actor. At the same time, however, at least since the financial crisis, almost 20 years ago now, the EU by some is seen as very much a crisis-driven political actor, as indeed, I think we've just heard it, are many national governments. The central argument here is that the EU seems to be in an almost permanent crisis mode, encouraging often short-term fixes with long-term political consequences. I have here next to me the Palgrave Handbook of EU Crisis that was published in 2020, before COVID and before the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and already then it came to almost 800 pages. So here the perception is the EU is crisis-driven. And then we have a third perspective, which is linked to the second, but I think analytically distinct, and that sees the EU as a case or as an example of emergency politics. Here the central argument is that the framing of policy challenges as emergencies allows executive actors to increase their power. This is the argument about executive aggrandizement. And the European Union is seen very much as an example of that. One leading proponent of such a view, and I'm simplifying the view to a certain extent, is Jonathan White from the LSE, who wrote about this and wrote a book about it, The Politics of the Last Resort. Now, against this background, we wanted to find out, I think I jumped there, yeah. Against this background, our project or this paper tries to find out, well, how frequently do EU actors actually invoke time pressure? Is the perception of the actors within the EU that they are operating permanently under time pressure? So the descriptive ambition of our project, as part of this project, is to make systematic observations across time and across different EU institutions, not just the Commission, and across different policies. Our focus today is on migration and asylum policy, but we also want to study other policy areas. So the descriptive ambition is to see how frequently do EU actors really invoke time pressure. Can we say anything systematic about that? We can all give examples where time pressure seems to have been of the essence, but it's quite a different task to systematically capture that and describe it, how it has evolved over time, how it works across different institutions, whether some institutions are much more likely to invoke time pressure than others, and also how it affects different policy domains or different policy areas. And the second question, after all, we're academics, is explanatory. When do EU actors invoke time pressure? So here we seek to determine whether invocations of time pressure are driven primarily by functional pressures, or whether they are perhaps increasingly driven by the desire for political responsiveness. Now, let's turn to the first question: how frequently do EU actors invoke time pressure? And when we started that project, I thought that would be relatively simple to answer. But to do this descriptive task has turned out to be much more challenging than perhaps we thought at the beginning, but we've solved the problems and now we've got data. What you have here is the data that we are using in this particular paper, as I said, focused on the European Commission and focused on the issue of migration and asylum. So first of all, we look at all speeches of the Home Affairs Commissioner, and of the Commission President. We tried to capture the totality of the number of speeches given during that period of observation, publicly available speeches. And we then checked how many of them referred to migration and asylum. And already you can see that the number of speeches that referred to migration and asylum varied considerably over time. And if you look at the dates, and if you then see how the different curves move, you see, of course, that there are peaks and troughs, and in particular, as one would expect, that there is a peak around what is seen as the perhaps peak of the migration and asylum crisis around 2015 and 2016 in Europe. That's the data that we're working with, and the data on which I'm concentrating in this particular presentation. As I said, we're trying to do this across the EU institutions and also extend it to the national level. This slide shows you how we actually then try to extract the information from that data for our purposes, namely to see how often, what is the frequency of invocations of time pressure. I won't say much more about this. If there are detailed questions, as I said, two of my colleagues are in the room who are probably better placed in order to answer that. Basically, what we have done is to use supervised machine learning and using state-of-the-art transformer-based models in order to extract from these speeches the number of invocations of time pressures by the actor. Now, what's quite important here, and so I spend a little bit more time on this slide, is that if you want to get reliable data on invocations of time pressure in political speech, you need to distinguish between explicit invocations, which are here shown on the right, and implicit invocations, which are shown on the left. Explicit invocations would run something like, we need to act fast. We have no time to lose. We need to act as early as possible. And that's relatively easy to detect. And as you can see here, if you look on the right, you see that such time pressure invocations, explicit invocations, again, have varied in this policy domain very considerably over time. I will say something more about what's happening here on the right since 2020 in particular. But that's not enough. Often there are also implicit time pressure invocations. What would those look like? For example, you would say numbers of asylum seekers are rising at an alarming rate. It doesn't explicitly say we need to do something, but implicitly it says there is time pressure for us to take action. Or you might say we are facing extraordinary short-term challenges. Again, there is no explicit time pressure invocations, but implicitly what you find is a call for action. If you look at the two over time, you will find that in many instances, implicit and explicit invocations are quite closely aligned, but not all of the time. At the height, for example, of the migration crisis, explicit time pressure invocations were more numerous than implicit ones. Since 2020, if you see what's going on the right, you will find that implicit time pressure invocations relating to migration and asylum are more frequent than explicit ones. Something has changed in the discourse around time pressure and migration at the European level, at least when you look at the speeches of commissioners and the Commission President. Now, when do EU actors invoke time pressure? Or put differently, what are the conditions or what are the causes that drive time pressure invocations? We need to distinguish here on the one hand between long-term structural factors. And by this we mean the legal authority of the European Union, and in particular of the Commission to act. And here the coming into force of the Lisbon Treaty has been a very important date, because it is only since then that the European Commission really has major authority in affairs of migration and asylum. And secondly, in our model, we focus on two situational factors. The first is problem pressure. We think it is reasonable to expect that problem pressure impacts or influences, not determines, but influences the frequency of time pressure invocations. And problem pressure is here measured by the number of asylum seekers, changes in the number of asylum seekers over time. Public pressure, public opinion, is measured by us by most important problem perceptions. If you look at Eurobarometer, it asks Europeans what they think is the most important problem that either or that affects their national government, their national political system, and also it asks what is the most important problem that confronts the European Union. That leads us, for the purposes of this paper, to two hypotheses. First of all, since the coming into force of the Lisbon Treaty, the Commission responds directly to rising asylum numbers with rising time pressure invocations. This is essentially, behind it is the expectation that the Commission responds to growing problem pressure. And the first way in which it can respond, and the most immediate way in which it can respond, is of course to invoke time pressure in its communication. Everything else, changing regulations, changing implementation, takes much more time. It's much more time consuming and much less under the control of the Commission, because of course it requires a cooperation of other actors within the European system. And the second hypothesis is that since, again, the coming into force of the Lisbon Treaty, rising asylum numbers also affect public priorities, the public perceptions of what the most important problems are. And this public perception in turn also affects time pressure invocations of the European Commission. So we expect that problem pressure both has a direct, as you can see from this causal model, we expect that problem pressure both has a direct effect on the Commission, but also that there is another path through public priority or the public perceptions of what the most important problems are. And the moderator is the authority that the European Commission actually has in questions of migration and asylum. So the variables that we have analyzed is time pressure invocations, their numbers, both implicit and explicit, the number of asylum seekers, those we got from Eurostat, they stand for problem pressure, and public opinion on the most important problem, which we get from Eurobarometer surveys covering 2002 to 2023, that stands for public pressure, for public opinion, and what its impact may be on how the actors at the European level, in this case, the Commission President and the Commissioners, view the urgency of a problem. We may briefly mention here how we did the statistical analysis. I won't say much more about this now, and go straight to this, at least by our standards, fairly colorful graph or number of graphs. What do we see here. First of all, we see variations in time pressure invocations. That is the yellowish, orangey, smoothed out here. The wave that you see a relatively slow rise from the early 1990s, and then a major increase from about 2010, 2012, going up through the height of what is seen as the height of the migration and asylum crisis, then going down and then going up again towards the end of our period of observation from about 2022. What is interesting here is that you have, and I will say a little bit more about that in a minute, that you have a delayed effect this time. Asylum numbers went up again, but the number of time pressure invocations by the Commission went up considerably later. What you also see is mapped here is what the European public thought was the most important problem at the country level, that is the light blue, and at the European level, that is the dark blue. And what is interesting here is that you have a considerable difference between what people think is the most important problem facing their own country, as opposed to the most important problem facing the European Union. Clearly, migration and asylum policy is now very strongly associated with the European Union, which in turn, of course, we would expect puts additional pressure on the European actors, in this case, including the Commission, to act and to respond. And finally, we have the red line, which shows you the migration and asylum numbers. Now, let me just highlight a few of the results which are behind these numbers and the kind of causalities that we found. First of all, if we just look descriptively and not in a causal way, we see that at least in the post-Lisbon period, there is a high descriptive alignment between the variables. In particular, public opinion seems to follow asylum numbers fairly closely. And interestingly, since 2015, as I just mentioned, more European citizens define immigration as a priority political issue for the European Union than for individual member states. That is an interesting finding. Second observation, which I may want to highlight, is that while the indicators after the 2015-16, the height of the migration crisis, whilst the indicators decrease slowly, that is both perception of migration and asylum being the most important issue, and also the time pressure invocations of the Commission, remember the orange wavy line, following the resumption of the increase in asylum seekers, which you see from about 2020, the red dots that you see here, it took considerable time before the Commission started to invoke time pressure again. And that is, I think, quite interesting and quite significant. What does this tell us? Well, it tells us that although functional pressures increasing asylum numbers have a strong influence on Commission communication, there is no automatic link, and that actors can think carefully about whether they want to stress time pressure in their political communication or whether they choose not to. Now, what's the relative magnitudes of the effects? I don't want to spend too long on that, and I think I'm probably already coming to the end of the time allotted to me. But let me just give you a flavor for what the relative magnitude is. So, for example, if we look, and go back again, if we look in the run-up to the refugee crisis, monthly asylum numbers in Europe increased at the height of the crisis around 2015-16. Monthly asylum numbers increased by around 100,000 to over 350,000 per month. Such an increase then would result in around 100 additional invocations of time pressure by the Commission in the following 12 months. On the other hand, if we look at an increase of priority of migration as the most important issue by the European citizens, then if you have an increase of from 10% to 30%, as happened at the height of the crisis, as you can see here, that would yield around an increase of around 140 additional invocations of time pressure by the Commission. So we have significant, we think very significant effects, both of higher numbers of asylum seekers, of time pressure invocations, and also of higher public pressure on time pressure invocations by the Commission through that model that we showed early on. So in conclusion, and I've just been able to give you a brief glimpse in what we are doing empirically, coming back to questions about the temporal orientation of the European Union and of the Commission specifically, is the EU still a long-term political actor? Well, there is evidence to suggest from our data that the growing politicization of EU policies has made the European Commission at least more responsive to volatile public opinion in its communications. And that is perhaps not surprising, given that we now have signs of an electoral cycle in the European Union through the introduction, direct elections to the European Parliament, Spitzenkandidaten model, both the Commission and Parliament running on a 5-year cycle. All that would lead us to expect that there are stronger incentives for the European Commission, not just to listen to public opinion, but to respond to it, at least in its communications. If the European people think that something is important and is urgent, then the European Commission also has an incentive to respond to that by stressing time pressure invocations. However, is the European Union a permanent crisis actor? Well, here, I think our findings suggest that the invocations of time pressure, of course, vary very substantively over time. We couldn't say, even in this policy field or this policy domain, that the European Commission is in a permanent crisis mode. It is not, at least in its communications. And as I said, in the data that we have from 2020, it would appear that the European Commission is downplaying explicit time pressure invocations. And to the extent that it does invoke time pressure, it does so more through the indirect, in an indirect way, the implicit, as we said, rather than explicitly. So whilst this perception of the EU as a crisis actor, of course, has some empirical foundation, it's not something that political scientists have just dreamt up. It is not in a permanent crisis mode, even in this policy domain, at least if we look at how the European Commission communicates. And finally, coming back to the argument about the EU as an emergency actor, we do see that invocations of time pressure are strongly linked to measurable problem pressure in terms of the number of asylum seekers. there isn't always a direct correlation, as I just mentioned. But also, it is not that, on the whole, we can say that time pressure invocations follow problem pressure very strongly. And I think that calls into question some of the arguments about the manipulative usage of time pressure, which have been put forward by some of our esteemed colleagues. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much, Klaus. Really interesting. I guess we see how the Commission are using or creating crisis to get things done. Harold Macmillan's events. So just a reminder to the audience, we have a Q&A there. Thanks to Ramsey for a couple of comments made. If you have any questions for our speakers, please put them up. I have a few here. Maybe just starting with Klaus, just building upon your presentation. Are we heading into a world where, with the kind of stuff that you're talking about, where there's more urgency and more time-specific pressures, whether from the fact that things are happening, or also that people are utilizing crisis to try to get things done or creating crisis? Is it becoming more difficult to make long-term decisions, given, I guess, the volatility of the news cycle and the amount of events that are happening, even when in a time with climate change and other grand challenges that we need more than ever to make long-term decision making? So is it, in a time when we need to make more long-term decisions, is it becoming more difficult to do so?
Well, we've had two perspectives. Much of what colleagues have said this morning, and also in our second slot, was very much on national governments under electoral pressure, under intense pressure by public media, under intense pressure by public opinion to do things very quickly, and how that might, as it were, crowd out thinking about the longer term and acting in the longer term. And many of the solutions which have been proposed are essentially about national governments or subnational governments or even local governments. So here the problem is, how do I get actors which are bound by an electoral cycle, which are strongly influenced by volatile public opinion, which face a strong opposition, which of course is trying to exploit weaknesses, how do I make them more long-term oriented? For the European Union, the discussion has been the opposite. It was seen as a technocratic actor, more or less dissociated from public opinion, more or less dissociated from electoral cycles. The whole discussion was, how do we democratize the European Union? How do we make European Union actors more responsive to the public, either through the route of the European Parliament or through other routes? And that's, as I said, the dominant perspective used to be, to the extent that one can simplify in that way, the dominant perspective used to be that the European Union, like some other international organizations, precisely because it was dissociated from electoral pressure, was better able to deal with long-term problems. And quite a few of the solutions that we have heard today about, how to design future-oriented institutions, in one way or the other, try to limit the influence of short-term electoral preferences, because we know that they are, not only are they very changeable, but the time horizons of the electors is maybe 5 years or 10 years, and not 20 or 30 or 50 years. So I would say what we see in the case of the European Union is that the European Union actors, and here we look in particular at the Commission, and we started our analysis with the Commission, because the Commission has so often been seen as the most technocratic part of the European Union. We see that once it gains authority in a policy field, and in this case, of course, a highly politicized policy field, namely migration and asylum, it is becoming more responsive. So that is, again, if you want, in democratic responsiveness and perhaps also in democratic accountability. and that will be a next step for the project, whether this growing, as it were, responsiveness to public opinion, this growing invocations of we need to act fast, we can't just say, you know, this will be in 5 years or in 10 years or in 15 years, whether this growing perception, self-perception, and also communication of time pressure, whether this will mean that the way in which the European Union acts in migration and asylum policy is becoming more short-term. Let me just, and then I shut up, say we also done a paper, and Radu Triculescu is probably in the room, and he took the lead on that paper, which is where we have studied the negotiation of the Asylum and Migration Pact that the European Union finally adopted sometime in the early summer of last year. Now you have all these time pressure invocations, but it took the full cycle of the European Parliament, a full 5-year cycle from the beginning to the end to negotiate that package. That's a very long time to take negotiating a package when you know and when you see that for the public, this is a very important issue, and the public associates this issue more with the European Union than with national governments. So in a sense, I think the evidence that we have in that sense is contradictory. Yes, growing time pressure invocations, but at the same time, the policy-making process is not so easy, of course, in Europe to accelerate. And as I said, negotiating the package, which was supposed to respond to this perception that something needs to be done, took a full 5 years. And some people say you can even trace it back further into the past.
Thanks, Klaus. Muiris, your hand is up there. Do you want to come in?
I do. I was just going to go back to something I was thinking of since Rhiannon's presentation, and maybe it's for yourself as well, Laurie, that this kind of a tautological issue that it actually takes time for the idea of long-term thinking to be embedded within government. And would you, I mean, you mentioned 10 years, it's 10 years in the Welsh context. And I know you mentioned, Laurie, in respect of NESTA, and Geoff mentioned it earlier. I mean, these things have waxed and waned a little bit in British government. But do you think, I mean, could either of you say something about, do you think is becoming part of the culture around policy making, of thinking of future generations and thinking long term? It's one thing to put it in legislation, but it's another for people to actually seriously, for this to kind of seep into people's thoughts. And I have a very quick question for Klaus. I have to say, from an Irish perspective, the EU that has been very transformative for forcing national government to think longer term in terms of policy appraisal and projects and so on. So that relationship between the international and the national has been fascinating. Of course, it probably works the other way as well. So thanks, Hale.
Thanks, Muiris. Laurie, maybe if you want to come in first, and then Rhiannon.
Yeah, sorry, I just put my hand up to indicate. So good question. So we don't have empirical evidence like Klaus does. So all I can give is my sort of observation and sort of sense. Certainly, my sense is, I think there has, in some circles, there has been more discussion of sort of future generations and those sorts of things, which I think is a good thing. So I think there's more narrative about it in discussion. I'm not persuaded that there's necessarily more action. And one observation I'd make is that lots of the way policymakers, quite understandably, look at the world is through a domain-specific lens. They'll look at climate change, then they'll look at aging, then they'll look at the economy as separate domains, often because that's the way certainly the UK and probably lots of other governments are organised, which means, and then within those you'll have policies to tackle long-termism, but they're often siloed from each other, because you might have a policy, an instrument that could tackle climate change that might be able to be picked up and adapted to, say, work in education or health or something like that. But because those domains are siloed, the lens to which people look at the world is a domain lens rather than a cross-cutting long-term lens, I think that's a sort of structural and cultural limitation that's a problem. And I suppose conversations like this hopefully try to sort of break that down. But there are some observations from me.
Thanks, Laurie. Rhiannon, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I can just come in on on the on the Act, and the fact that it's taken 10 years just to get to where we are now, which is far from where we really want to be, if I'm honest. There's lots of things around that, like, we've managed to get really good awareness of the legislation now. Most people in public sector organisations know what it is. They don't understand how it applies to specifically their role. So, it's like acting on climate change. It's the people who have climate change in their job titles that are pulling all the weight. But you need your finance directors on board. You need leadership buy-in from the top. If they don't get it, it's not going to happen. And you'll have these really strong champions, people who are working away, trying to embed the Act and all those ways of working and everything. But they're hitting a brick wall all the time because they don't have that buy-in in the rest of the organisation. And there are a couple of issues around that as well, which is one, that the legislation we have in Wales doesn't really have enforcement powers for penalties or sanctions. So, people describe it as not having teeth. So it's a real soft power of advice and recommendations and challenge and support and all of those things, which are great for nurturing good relationships with the bodies that we're working with. But, there's nothing to say they have to do any of the things that we advise or recommend, and that's a real sticking point. So when they've then got, the earlier question about, does a crisis help with getting things done? There are so many different crises happening. Our experience in Wales is a health crisis with obesity, mental health, a cost of living crisis. Since coming out of the EU, all these other crises, which pick your poison, which one are you going to tackle first? And when you're looking at things like health and things like cost of living, when you start applying that long-term lens to them, you see that the things that you're going to do are actually going to bring down costs. Energy efficiency in homes, it's about bringing down costs. Active travel is about making people healthier and well. And those are the things which will then take the pressure off those health services and things which are getting all of the funding. But it's really, really difficult to take the leap from that, fixing those acute problems, to trying to move to a different place of preventing those problems happening in the first place. Sounds simple, but it's really not. And politically, no one wants to touch it. Who's going to say we're going to take funding out of the NHS? Nobody wants to say that, do they? So it's a really, really difficult transition to make.
Thanks, Rhiannon. We're minute to one, but just let Klaus in his head there, maybe just for a short response, and we'll wrap things up. Klaus, thanks, Rhiannon.
Just on that point, I think what we're looking at, you see clear variation over time. You see that there are periods when problem pressure and time pressure invocations are very closely aligned, and you see other periods when that is less so. And you see in particular in recent years a preference perhaps more to implicit invocations, the description of the problem. There is a rapid rise, there is a major sudden change, rather than the explicit one. Now, we don't know yet what is behind that, but I think there is evidence to suggest that if you tell people over and over again for many years that something is urgent, and it keeps on being urgent, and it keeps on being urgent, that communication reaches the end of its utility. People don't want to hear anymore, and they don't believe it anymore. So although this is not the focus of what we are doing, and there are people in this room who know much more about how governments work and how they communicate and what's behind it and what goes in it and what people make of it. It seems that the constant invocation of urgency, for example, around the climate crisis, can backfire, and that a communication strategy which focuses more on the description of the problem rather than stressing continuously the urgency of the reaction in the face of evidence which shows that the reactions are slow and difficult, may not be a very clever way of communicating about it. It may be better to let people take their own conclusions from the implicit description of the time pressure rather than the constant explicit invocation of it.
Thanks very much, Klaus, and thanks to all our speakers. And thanks, Muiris, for suggesting the topic. It became really timely that the event coincided with the decision to open an office for future planning. I'm sure we could have continued this conversation for much longer. And I imagine as people are given tasks to establish this new office, there'll be a request for slides and a report of what we discussed today, which will feed into the establishment of the new office. It strikes me as there's so much to do here. And the questions are getting bigger and bigger. Our challenge is to have the institutions to make things happen and to deal with long-term issues. I think we're a long way from that. But it's been an excellent conversation this morning. So to thank everybody involved, our speakers, our chairs, thanks Martha and colleagues in the Academy for all the support in helping this happen. And thank you to the audience for sticking with us all morning on a great event. I was delighted to be here. So thank you all, and good luck for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks, Cathal. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you. Bye. Ciao.
Thanks, Cathal.